Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome back to the second day of our conference, Ascetic Practices in the Mind, Mental Healing in Eastern Christianity. I would like to welcome all of you physically here and all our friends that are joining virtually to our conference. Please make your way to the seats and we will start.
It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Jennifer Hurt. Professor Hurt is a Gilbert Stark Professor of Christian Ethics at Yale University Divinity School. She's published widely on virtue ethics, early modern and modern moral thought, is a member of several editorial boards, and served as the 2020 president of the Society of Christian Ethics. She is the author most recently of She researched the animal dimensions of human moral agency as a senior member of a Templeton-funded research grant supporting science-informed theological anthropology. Professor Hurt will present to us Beyond the Therapeutic Mindset, Charting a Path for Empirical Study of Christian Contemplative Practices. Professor Hurt.
Thank you very much, Father Deisinger, and thank you to the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to be here. As you perhaps have already gathered from the introduction, I maybe wasn't the most natural choice for this conference, as I'm not in any way an expert in in Eastern monasticism, early Christian monastic thought, and so on. But I've spent a lot of my career focused on the virtues and on ethical formation, and so thinking about spirituality and spiritual formation has always been part of the picture, even if not the center of attention for me. And I have along the way acquired some familiarity with psychological and neuroscientific approaches to the virtues and to virtue formation. And so I was excited, intrigued by the possibility of coming here and being able to think alongside experts in ancient monasticism and in conversation with contemporary empirical studies of contemplative practices. And I was aware that, as I think we all are aware now, that there's been quite a lot of excitement about meditation practices in the broader society. And there seems to be a kind of golden opportunity at the moment to think about specifically Christian contemplative practices in conversation with this. But as I've delved more and more into this, it's really come as something of a shock to realize just how little research, empirical research, has been done specifically on Christian contemplative practices. That's also exciting because it opens up a vast arena for future research, and I think this can be productive. But it meant that my own understanding of what I might be able to contribute in this context has shifted a little bit, and I've ended up focusing on really a kind of ground clearing project of trying to think about a conceptual path forward for research like this, hoping to be able to avoid some pitfalls. So as Buddhism was received in the West, it was often detached from its metaphysical commitments. And this in turn made Buddhist spiritual practices, and notably what we always hear about, mindfulness meditation, attractive to many Americans and Western Europeans who absorbed these practices as compatible with, rather than competing with, their existing religious commitments and practices, or who were attracted because they were already alienated from Christianity, alienated from religious institutions, and were seeking alternative modes of spirituality. And I think particularly attractive has been the perceived compatibility of at least secularized forms of Buddhist meditation with modern Western science. The blossoming of interest in spirituality in contemporary late modern Western cultures has paid far less attention to the deep resources of the Christian tradition for contemplative practices. You wouldn't know it from the riches of this weekend. And very little empirical research, as I just mentioned, has been done to date on the psychosocial effects of Christian contemplative practice as compared with Buddhist-derived mindfulness meditation. But there are increasingly calls for attention to these resources, both on the part of those that are seeking to meet the spiritual needs of contemporary Christians, including those who count themselves as spiritual but not religious, and on the part of psychological researchers. In turning to empirical study, it's important to be clear about what psychological and neuroscientific studies can and cannot do, can and cannot show. Neuroscientists can study correlations between meditative practices and the activation of certain neural networks. They can use a variety of tools to do this. So they can use tools that measure blood flow in the brain, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, positron emission tomography, PET, as well as tools that measure electrical currents, electroencephalograms, EEGs, and magnetic fields that are produced by electrical currents, so magnetoencephalograms, MEGs. They can study what forms of brain activity are occurring when practitioners report having particular sorts of phenomenological experiences, including experiences of God or of communion with God, experiences of enlightenment, experiences of non-duality, and so on. They can investigate whether these patterns of brain activity vary from baseline forms of activity, how much they vary. They can also study the thickness of various regions of the brain and measure neuroplasticity, how the structure of the brain changes over time. Psychologists, meanwhile, can study the correlation between contemplative practices and various psychological effects. How long do these effects last? How robust are the effects? Are they found in novices, or are they only found in highly experienced practitioners, and so on and so forth? But of course, there is a good deal that empirical studies cannot do as well. And most significantly, these neuroscientific and psychological studies can't either confirm or disconfirm that contemplation in fact involves experience of God or experience of a supernatural or a transcendent reality. One researcher notes, quote, "People may or may not actually be connecting to God or the supernatural, but ultimately there is something very powerful going on in the brain," end quote. Showing that there is a neural basis for mystical experiences and that distinctive things are going on in the brain when they occur need not result in reductive eliminativism. Every kind of experience will be associated with some kind of activity in the brain. So it's kind of a basic point, but I think it's an important one because there can be quite a lot of discomfort that's associated with allowing empirical study to be done of what one takes to be the most significant spiritual experiences. But this basic point about what can and cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed can, I think, address and hopefully remove that fear, at least, if not the discomfort. Early neuroimaging studies often emerged with contradictory results. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail, but it's become clear that a major cause of the contradictory results that were emerging from these studies was a failure to distinguish among different kinds of meditative practice. So there's a recent large-scale meta-analysis, so it's studying many, many studies of meditative practice that have been done, and trying to compare them with one another. And this was a meta-analysis specifically of neuroimaging studies of meditation. And it showed that patterns of brain activation and deactivation differ significantly for different kinds or categories of meditation. So this meta-analysis differentiated focused attention meditation, mantra recitation, open monitoring, and loving kindness, which they collapsed with compassion meditation. And there were differences in brain activation, and they thought, extrapolating from that with a little bit less evidence, that there were also different patterns for less studied categories known as visualization, sense withdrawal, and non-dual awareness. And I'm laughing a bit to myself because they present themselves as giving an exhaustive categorization of kinds of meditation. But in fact, when you look at it, these are really all based on Buddhist and Hindu forms of meditative practice. So what other forms of meditative practice are being left out here, and how should they be categorized? But it's still very interesting research. So in all cases, we find the activation of certain neural networks is present alongside the deactivation of other networks. It makes sense that forms of meditation that involve directing attention to a specific object, say, or directing attention to one's breath moving in and out, would differ in terms of the neural networks that are activated from a kind of meditation that focuses on the recitation of a mantra, or those like mindfulness that involve attending to the present moment, to whatever thoughts and emotions come and go. And that would be different again from a kind of meditation that's focused on deepening feelings of joy and compassion with all living things, and so forth. So there makes a certain kind of common sense here. And yet, many neuroimaging studies have failed to differentiate among different kinds of meditation, or they have differentiated according to tradition of origin. And it's not actually clear that differentiating, Buddhist meditation from Hindu meditation is well, not that it's not an important form of differentiation, but it may not be adequately differentiated. You may need to break it down much more than that. When studies do differentiate among various forms of meditative practice, the results are again suggestive, but they're also commonsensical. So again, without getting into the detail about telling you which exact neural networks are activated, focused attention meditation was associated with activation in regions that are associated with cognitive control and self-reflection, and deactivation in regions associated with mind wandering. Mantra recitation activated regions associated with motor components of speech, and deactivated areas that are involved in processing external sensory inputs, including comprehension of language. So speech activation, comprehension of language deactivated. Open monitoring meditation activated regions involved in the voluntary regulation of thought and action, along with deactivation of regions involved in the selective filtering out of sensory signals. Well, that makes sense, right? Open meditation, you're not filtering out sensory signals, you're letting them all come in. Loving kindness and compassion meditations activated brain regions involved in empathy and the perception of pain. There were a few common features. One common feature was increased cortical thickness, so evidence of neuroplasticity and increased thickness of the cortex of the brain. And then the only region that was consistently recruited or activated across these meditation types was the insula, which is seen to be involved in monitoring and conscious awareness of internal body states, empathy, and metacognition. But even here, there were different parts of the insula that were activated by different meditation types. So these results suggest that neuroimaging studies of Christian meditative practices might fruitfully begin by asking whether the meditative practices of Christian monastics map closely onto any of the categories that have already been identified in the empirical study of meditation, or whether they differ substantially enough to require the creation of new categories. So one thing that has been suggested is that Christian centering prayer is very similar to mindfulness meditation, and that both could be considered forms of open monitoring meditation. So both encourage focus on the present moment, detachment from cogitative thinking, and there have been some very small studies that have started to look into this. So a very small study compared blood flow in different areas of the brain during meditation by 3 Christian Franciscan nuns and 8 Tibetan Buddhist monks who were engaged in, actually in this case, in focused attention meditation, and found similar patterns of neural activation. Now, this is a very small sample size, so it's too small to allow robust conclusions, but the results suggest that comparative studies of this sort might confirm the fruitfulness for neuroimaging studies of grouping practitioners according to features like open monitoring and focused attention. Now, if it turns out to be the case that what is going on in the brains of Christians who meditate exhibit the same patterns as of Buddhists and Hindus who meditate when differentiated according to something like open focus or focus on a verbal text or whatever, this, of course, raises its own questions. It raises philosophical and theological questions. So in this small study that I just mentioned, the Christians in the study, these Franciscan nuns, reported experiencing communing with God, union with God. And the Buddhists experienced being endlessly and intimately interwoven with everything the mind senses. So you could say, well, both had experiences of unity, but obviously these were very different kinds of experiences of unity. And as Richard Jones has pointed out, this raises the question of whether we could say the monks, the Christian nuns and the Buddhist monks here had the same experiences, which they interpreted differently, or whether they had different experiences, but the different experiences were linked with similar patterns of neural activation. Now, if the differences stem from interpretation, this supports constructivist explanations of mystical experiences. According to constructivists, there are no unmediated experiences. All experiences are processed through the experiencer's culturally formed concepts. On the other hand, if the differences don't stem from interpretation, then very different experiences can be tied to very similar patterns of neurological activation. But then on reflection, this wouldn't be particularly surprising because neuroscience is still in its infancy and the results at this point are anything but fine-grained. I mean, we're still just figuring out what patterns of activation need, you know. The fact that both the Christian and the Buddhist participants in this study engaged in something like focused attention is probably sufficient to explain the results without leading to any conclusion whatsoever about whether the differences in their experiences, their subjective experiences, stemmed from distinctions inherent to their experiences or from the interpretations that they brought to those experiences. It's not clear that neuroscience has the means to settle this debate between the constructivists and the non-constructivists. And this is because neuroscience can study neurological correlates of reported experiences, but neuroscience doesn't study experience itself. This is related to the so-called hard problem of consciousness that was made famous by David Chalmers. Cognitive science, Chalmers suggests, can get a handle on things like how organisms discriminate among stimuli, integrate information, access internal states, control behavior, and so on. And these questions can be answered by identifying neural mechanisms that accomplish these behaviors. Neural mechanisms that enable discrimination among stimuli, integration of information, accessing internal states, and so on. But the hard problem of consciousness has to do with subjective experience, with what it feels like to the organism. And even when all the mechanisms have been identified, the question remains of why certain functions are accompanied by experience and why these experiences have the quality that they do. So a reductive explanation here that simply says we've taken care of explaining everything there is when we've identified the mechanisms, that kind of reductive explanation simply ignores the thing to be explained here, the quality of the experience. The correlations that are observed by neuroscience between experiences as described by participants and what is taking place neurologically and physiologically may be illuminating, but they should not be seen as explanations of the qualia of experience themselves. So this debate between constructivists and non-constructivists is probably not scientifically tractable. But setting that debate aside, there's much to be gained by attending to the reported phenomenological quality of experience, even in the empirical study of meditation. It might, for instance, help us to identify distinct neurological networks that are involved in various aspects of attention, such as the difference between attending when we're anticipating an incoming stimulus, when we're orienting to a stimulus, when we have executive attention, a focus in the context of multiple stimuli. All right, so thus far, I've focused primarily on the mechanisms of meditation and their neurological correlates. But there's also intense interest in studying the psychophysical results of meditation. And there's been accumulating evidence that mindfulness meditation, which is the kind that has been most intensively studied, but therefore likely other forms of open monitoring meditation, so that it's likely to include centering prayer, fairly robust evidence that these have a range of health benefits. Mindfulness meditation increases immune system activity. It reduces anxiety and depression. It reduces symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, decreases chronic pain, and improves sleep quality. Compassion meditation is linked with reduction in cortisol levels when observing stressful experiences in others. Compassion meditation is also correlated with decreases in C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, which are linked to risk for vascular disease. It's thought that many of these beneficial effects of meditation are mediated by improved attention and emotion regulation. Experienced meditators are more able to sustain attention to task, less prone to mind wandering, and more able to shift attention at will. Meditation may decrease anxiety and depression by decreasing patterns of negative self-referential thought. Strengthened emotion regulation may be facilitated by greater top-down regulation of the amygdala, which is less activated in experienced meditators. And a brief aside here to say that there is the interesting fact that most research has asked only about positive effects, but when one does ask about negative effects, those are found as well. They're found kind of in proportion to how much one asks for them. So it's a much more complicated picture than the one that emerges from just looking at these positive effects. Of course, it could be that the negative effects are transient and an experienced meditator moves beyond them, but again, not nearly enough research has been done on that. So once we turn our attention to this question of the psychophysical results, the health benefits, and so on, we encounter another site for theological reflection. Buddhist traditions don't advocate meditation as a means to mental or physical health. Fundamentally, they advocate meditation as a pathway to enlightenment, to relief from suffering by a recognition of the no-self. But many people now practice Buddhist-derived forms of meditation purely in hope of improving their mental or physical health. It's a cultural contingency, but I think one of some significance for the scientific study of meditation that East Asian meditative practices entered into the Western context in ways that fostered the extraction of practice from theory or from theology or from ontological commitment. And scientists who've formed this kind of extraction have rarely met with pushback from religious communities. And maybe that's not that surprising, given that Buddhist practices entered the West, on the one hand, through a kind of orientalizing spiritual tourism, on the one hand, and on the other hand, by way of immigrants who initially had very little social capital. So the adoption of mindfulness meditation in broad swaths in this Western context has fit rather easily with the therapeutic mindset of Western modernity. Mindfulness meditation is touted for its effects on health, wellness, energy, stress reduction, and emotional stability, and that's about it, right? That's why you would go in for these things. So how ought Christian thinkers position themselves in relationship to this therapeutic agenda? As I've already suggested, there's nothing to prevent Christians and Buddhists alike from insisting that health benefits of contemplative practices flow from or are byproducts of their spiritual benefits. Those who adopt meditative practices simply for the sake of hoped-for health benefits can be viewed as missing out on the true meaning, on the deeper benefit, on the ultimate telos of these practices. There may, though, be some fear that touting the health benefits of meditation may have the effect over time of hollowing out these practices, given that persons who are shaped so fundamentally by the therapeutic mindset of late Western modernity may simply aspire to nothing beyond mental and physical health. I think there's actually no simple way to lay these concerns to rest. It might, though, be possible to turn things around ever so slightly in a productive fashion. We might accept that most who embark on meditative practice in the context of secularized late modernity will do so as a form of therapy. They might nevertheless be invited to grow through this practice into a deeper yearning. This sort of invitatory practice of contemplation can, I think, be something quite different from a secularized practice of contemplation. This invitation into a more transformed life, or at least that's my hope. In this final section of my talk, I will say a little bit more about the research questions that I would hope someday to be able to address, and that these are growing out of the project that Father Luke mentioned on my current project on more than human ethical agency. And I hope I won't sound too crazy. In his classic essay on leisure, the basis of culture, Josef Pieper characterizes ratio, discursive thought, as the most distinctively human form of knowing. He insists at the same time that the human mind is also capable of intellectus, which he calls the name for the understanding, insofar as it is the capacity of simplex intuitus, of that simple vision to which truth offers itself like a landscape to the eye. He characterizes intellectus as effortless awareness, as contemplative vision. In contrast to the activity of ratio, intellectus is passive, or rather receptive. But I feel that there's a tension at the heart of Pieper's characterization of intellectus. On the one hand, it's a form of knowing or understanding. On the other hand, it's understanding at the limits of its capacity. There is, as Pieper says, a certain serenity in leisure which springs precisely from our inability to understand, from our recognition of the mysterious nature of the universe. It springs from the courage of deep confidence so that we are content to let things take their course. When Pieper's focused on this former aspect, intellectus as a form of knowing, he emphasizes that it's a faculty of grasping the world as a whole, this activity, grasp it. Pieper here is echoing a continental tradition of philosophical anthropology associated with Max Scheler and Helmut Plessner. He characterizes non-human animals, in contrast, as imprisoned by their environments. Human beings have a capacity for spiritual knowledge that has the power to establish relations with the whole of reality. Again, the emphasis on activity, on grasping, and that's what intellectus is. But there's also this other side of intellectus, its receptivity, its passivity, which might be expressed, he says, in utter absorption in some particular, a rose in bud, a child at play. And at such moments, we might say, serenity arises out of letting go of the attempt to understand. Not a grasping of the whole, but a relinquishment of any effort to grasp the whole. Eric Darrell Meyer has traced a similar tension back through early Christian theology, focusing on Gregory Nazianzus in particular. Nazianzus, while regularly characterizing redemption as a purification of human flesh from its animality, also figures animals as icons of divine mystery. Meyer writes, he inadvertently describes ordinary animals as living in a mode of intimacy with divine intelligence that is indistinguishable from his account of the highest aims of human contemplation, as contemplation cultivates a form of unthinking participation in divine wisdom. And we might trace this perhaps to Dionysius's non-ratiocinative knowledge of God, or perhaps see it as resonating with Gregory of Nyssa's non-conceptual knowledge of God by way of encounter, or perhaps with the loss of self-awareness, the wonder of which Isaac of Nineveh wrote, and we were discussing yesterday. In contemplation, do we participate in something angelic, something active, this grasping of the whole, or does quieting the incessant chatter of discursive thought enable us to participate in something closer to a state of consciousness that is available to other animals at peace and rest? It's a difficult question to answer, lacking access, as we do, of course, to the subjective character of non-human animal consciousness. But maybe there are a few indirect ways of starting to get at this question. One might, for instance, employ some of the same neurological approaches that are being used to study the effects of meditation on human brains in order to study brain activity of other animals at rest versus when they're engaged in various forms of activity under stress and so on. The relevant techniques are still being developed. There remain challenges with measuring brain activity during movement, and most other animals like to keep moving around while we study their brain activity. But there are suggestive findings in experiments that involved inducing rhythmic activity in the mouse anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. And I mean, this is where I'm getting a little crazy, but just throwing some things out there here, some suggestive research. Rhythmic activity in the ACC has been shown to increase in human beings who engage in sustained integrated mind-body meditation training. When rhythmic activity in the mouse ACC was stimulated over an extended period of time, those mice exhibited a reduction in behaviors associated with anxiety as compared with mice not receiving ACC stimulation. Of course, this does not show that human feelings of peacefulness associated with relief from discursive thinking, relief from our constant cogitation, is really akin to the mouse experience of induced rhythmic activity in the ACC. But we should at least consider the possibility that some of the states of consciousness that are achieved through the practice of meditation bring us closer to, rather than distancing us from, the experiences of some of our non-human animal kin. So I'm looking forward to research in comparative neuroscience that might help us to explore this kind of question. Perhaps more tractable and also of great interest are questions in this vicinity that focus solely on humans. What would it mean to try to think about identifiable neurological correlates of ratio and intellectus? Are these categories useful at all? Are they too broad? Does intellectus in particular, where I discern this kind of tension in Pieper's understanding of intellectus that I think goes back deep, deep into the tradition, does intellectus reflect an isobal pattern of neurological activity or multiple? And could we differentiate among those different strands? More generally, it seems to me that there's a huge amount of work to be done, and at least a potential for doing it in ways that actually are productive for those who practice contemplation. Thank you.
Brother Theophan Miskovich, who will be presenting next, was formerly a research scientist at X, the Moonshot Factory, previously known as Google X, the semi-secret research and development facility, whose aim was to invent and launch radical new technologies aimed at making the world a better place. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor of psychology and integrative neuroscience at Binghamton University, part of the State University of New York system. His research has examined the interplay of emotion, attention, and motivation, the function and development of spontaneous human brain dynamics, and human brain neuromodulation using electromagnetism and ultrasonic methods. In 2016, he was honored with the Rising Star Award bestowed by the Association for Psychological Science. The prestigious award recognizes early career scientists who have made significant contributions to psychological science. In 2023, Brother Theophan entered New Skeet Monastery as a novice monk. Brother Theophan.
Thank you, Robin, and all of the organizers for inviting me to speak at the conference. Very grateful for this opportunity. And today I'd like to just share some ideas that reflect the marriage of two fields of inquiry that have been really very dear and close to my heart for a while. And this is the union of scientific and contemplative understanding. And my hope is that the ideas that I will discuss are living ideas, ideas that can be implemented and lived out. So we take them out of here into our regular world and hopefully make use of them. Metropolitan Callistus Ware predicted that the theological leitmotif of the 21st century will be an anthropological one. A burning question to address will be, what is the human person? Maybe more so than the ecclesiological question of what is the church, which occupied so many theologians in the past centuries. Metropolitan Callistus envisioned that answering this foundational question of human personhood should reflect a confluence of streams, not only theology, but the totality of human endeavor, including the sciences and the arts. And here I would also add neuroscience, psychology, and contemplative practice. So here's a brief map of the territory I'd like to cover today. So first, to start, I want to spend some time on what we could call the diagnosis of the human condition, specifically our fallen, fragmented human condition. Theosis is a journey of transcendence that aims at something far more integrated, wholesome, and holy relative to the position in which humans find themselves in this world. But in order to know where we are headed, we need a really precise understanding of where we're starting. So the story that I'm telling you today is a story about being in or out of communion with reality. It's a story about how we move from being initially isolated, separated, fragmented, and head toward being more integrated, holistic, and whole. And we do that through communion. And after this groundwork, the second half of the talk then reviews some of the key processes involved in this dynamic of healing. And rather than overwhelming you with a lot of background information on the brain, I'm going to be making extensive use of different metaphors, analogies, and images for us to contemplate. So first, theosis. Now in the Christian understanding, theosis is the purpose and aim of our human life. It's why we are on this planet. But what is it? Well, first of all, it's a living reality. In other words, it's to be lived by persons who are walking that path of theosis. But as I'm defining it today, theosis is a lifelong, dynamic process of deep interior transformation onto likeness with God and Christ as the ultimate archetype. Through consistent synergia, or co-action of human effort and divine grace, it affects a gradual transformation of human consciousness, changing our subjectivity down to its roots, with ever-deepening deification and sanctification of all human functions, including thought, desire, emotion, imagination, willpower, virtuous action, and our physical bodies. And today, I'm only going to be speaking about the human pole or the human dimension of the synergia. In other words, that side of this equation that requires effort and spiritual ascesis, because the divine contribution to this is a profound mystery that I certainly can't say much about. So we can see Theosis as a lifelong journey in a symphonic movement from a state of incoherence, disorder, and fragmentation toward wholeness, integration, and communion between self, creation, God, and the whole created world. Today, we will glimpse something about this dynamical movement from multiple levels, integrating patristics, neuroscience, psychology, and contemplative practice. So the beginning of the Theosis journey is from a state of spiritual illness. It is a state of being out of communion with God, an ultimate reality, and inhabiting what I refer to as an ego tunnel. An ego tunnel is a highly subjective state of consciousness in which the human being is chained to the pull of passions, disordered movements of the soul and body. So I would define the fallen condition as a psychosomatic mode of organization in which our governing experience is that of being skin-encapsulated egos who are striving to satisfy passing pleasures and avoid all pain and discomfort. And then we die. Metropolitan John Zizulis called this our biological hypostasis. That's what we're born into. Now, as the Romanian theologian Dumitru Stăniloae put it, the essence of the passions is that they render the human being passive to the sway of impulses over which we have no intentional control. In short, the fallen human being is an automaton or a robot. Science primarily concerns itself with the study of the human as a sophisticated automaton or a biocomputer. By contrast, patristic anthropology has always distinguished itself by emphasizing two distinct modes of human existence. There are two paths we can take in life. The first path is what I just mentioned. It's a merely biological hypostasis. This mode is sensory or image-driven, it's reactive, it's mechanical, essentially it's sleepwalking our way through life. It's passively molded and shaped by collisions with passions and logismoi, thoughts, that are all conditioned by the mindless laws of association. But there is another path through life, the straight and narrow gate, the path of theosis. And this requires intentional effort, cooperating with the energies of God's deifying grace and energies, and it results in reformation of the human person according to the archetype of Christ. These two paths in life are mentioned numerous times throughout the scriptures and patristic commentaries on the scriptures. And I've organized some of the different terms in this table, and you will note that the left column in this table corresponds to our default starting position, from which theosis is trying to move us away from. In other words, the left column is that mode of human function that is involuntary, following in the tracks passively laid down by experience and taking a path of least resistance. The right-hand column requires effort or spiritual ascesis. It is conscious, voluntary, requires wrestling with one's more automatic reactions. Or we could understand this as a divinely guided psychotherapy or re-education of the merely biological and animal side of our human nature. Now, I'd like to move just a little bit, into the neurobiology of all of this. And obviously, I have nowhere near the amount of time required to do this topic any justice. So I'm going to be oversimplifying. I ask for your forgiveness. But at least one major brain network that we should introduce here is the so-called default mode network, or the DMN. And the brain structures that make up the default mode network are shown as colorful blobs on this slide. These structures are recruited together in synchrony as the network comes online when we are not intentionally directing our attention. So this is the network responsible for the noisy mental chatter and all the fantasizing that we do so much of. It likes to time travel. It's often ruminating about things that happened in the past. It's fantasizing about the future, or it's worrying about the future. And it keeps a running commentary about everything that is going on right now, and involves mindlessly generating all the opinions, judgments, and thoughts about others and what others think about us that often dominate and sap our energies. So the default mode network corresponds to that very busy, speedy, and repetitive part of our mental faculty that continually creates the sense of being a solid, separate self. Martin Laird wrote that we spend much of our time mind-tripping on inner videos. Well, the main production center of these inner videos is right here, the default mode network. And a very substantial chunk of the brain's metabolic energy goes into maintaining this sort of spontaneous, freewheeling mode of operation. Now, I don't mean to demonize the default mode network because it does serve important purposes. It can also be the basis for creative thinking, free association, problem solving. And there is certainly a benefit in remembering the past to learn useful lessons from it. So for example, the default mode network would probably be highly engaged or activated during the contemplative practice of the remembrance of death. So that's a good thing. So the default mode network has its very legitimate and necessary uses. The problem, though, is that unless we are practicing conscious self-monitoring, or Nepsis, as I'll talk about, it easily gets kicked into hypergear. So the default mode network has a tendency to become excessively isolated from the rest of the brain and from the rest of the body. It slips out of communion, so to speak. And to make it worse, we're set up in evolutionary terms to just give more importance and attention to negative experiences. So we're often stewing in this sort of negative, judgmental brain chatter, this monologue that's always happening. Contemplative tools and ascesis, combined with a sacramental life, can help us to steer and guide the default mode network to make sure that we can tell the warning signs of a runaway train and help to bring it into a state of integration or communion with the rest of the brain, the rest of the body, and the rest of the God's creation. Now, the brain maintains an actively updated, gradient, hierarchical representation of space and time, self and world. And we can situate the default mode network as occupying the very top rung of this hierarchy. So in other words, what that means is that it is the furthest removed from the actual raw facts of life as it is lived in the present moment. Instead, the default mode network primarily deals with running as-if simulations, and a good chunk of our mental suffering originates from getting completely absorbed into these simulations. So our subjective adult life is spent heavily enmeshed in abstract conceptual frames, all entangled with verbal networks, with language. And we contact life to a large degree through this intermediate filter, substantially conditioned by this overly isolated or separated default mode network. And one outcome of this is a state that is known as cognitive fusion. In other words, we easily mistake our thoughts about reality for reality itself. And the sad truth is that this heavily constricts and limits our freedom, potential, and dignity as whole human beings made in the image of God. The core fixation seems to go something like this. I am over here, and I'm separate from something other that is over there. And once we fixate on something other, then our brains automatically begin to evaluate. Do I like it or do I dislike it? Is it for me or is it against me? Do I accept it or do I reject it? Now, these are all concepts, but they form the frames that compose those internal movies that we then get involved in or mind trip on. And one implication of this is that our ordinary, so-called normal state of waking consciousness is actually very similar in nature to an online form of dreaming or hallucinating. And this metaphor of waking life as being a kind of a dream is not only something you encounter in Buddhism. Patristic references are full of similar allusions. Now, if you're curious to know more details about some of the neuronal and psychological glue that keeps this dream-creating engine or process running, I recently wrote a book about this topic, combining insights from neuroscience and contemplative traditions. And that book will be out in early 2025, next year. Now, I'd like to use a visual metaphor here. So, you see that there is a substantial dense layer of trash completely cluttering the surface of this mountain river, making the river's surface lose its natural transparency in reflecting the beauty of the natural world around it. That dense canopy of trash represents the thicket of concepts, filters, and all those as-if simulations that are constantly throttling our mind stream. Unfortunately, we often mistake our very identity with that layer of trash that is floating on the top. And we're never making direct contact with the fresh, pristine, living waters that run below the surface thoughts and below the surface emotions. And as a result, we lose our transparency to the freshness of reality that surrounds us. So what I'd suggest is that just as much as we talk about conservation of the outer environment, we need to concern ourselves with becoming more conscious stewards of our inner environments. And in fact, I would suggest that the two are intimately related. The outer reflects the inner. Now, I want to talk about asceticism and its discipline as a very rigorous form of mind training. So first, what is the main purpose or aim of asceticism? And I love this quote, which comes from an essay by a French Orthodox archimandrite, Elie. And he says that asceticism is a liberation from the meshes of individuality. We are entangled in the nets of our own subjectivity regularly. And this is a genuine illusion. We perceive the world through this filter, and we think we're experiencing reality, but we're very rarely having glimpses of the actual freshness of reality. And upon reading this quote about the aim of asceticism, which is to basically perform an unveiling or an uncovering, I immediately had this image of this icon of Christ come to my mind, where he's resurrecting Lazarus from the tomb. So truth, in the person of Christ, arrives to unwrap the tangled veils of subjectivity from our inner spiritual eyes in order to reveal itself. And it allows us to transcend our limited biological hypostasis and become Eucharistic human beings. So my suggestion is that asceticism of the mind, to some extent at least, can be approached as an extremely sophisticated science of inner experience. So when I, as a mind scientist and a novice contemplative, when I really began to immerse myself in the rich spiritual tradition of orthodoxy, I discovered that the church fathers and mothers were masterful psychologists. And it's no wonder, really, because the persons who were most intensely engaged in this interior, unseen warfare were not only discovering, but transcending the laws that shape and constrain the flow of our psychological life. They were transforming their consciousness from the inside out down to its roots and leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs for future explorers. Now, I've highlighted just a few key processes that I'd like for us to discuss today. And they are Nepsis, or what today we might call attention control, inner prayer, or contemplative prayer, and deepening of embodiment. And these three processes interact to produce a lasting shift in a human being's psychosomatic center of gravity, making human persons increasingly more transparent and receptive to the energies of grace. Now, I labeled these processes separately for the sake of our discussion, but really they form a dynamical virtuous cycle. Each component amplifies and strengthens the next component, and together they impart energy for the growth of a new human being embodied in the image or archetype of Christ. So first, Nepsis, also known as watchfulness, sobriety of mind, or what a modern psychologist might refer to as attention control. The English translators of the Philokalia defined it as an attitude of attentiveness. It involves a self-observation of inward thoughts and fantasies. It entails keeping some control or a guard over the intellect, that is, thoughts, memories, and imaginations, and also a guard over the heart, motivational impulses and emotions. Now, Nepsis is not necessarily intense concentration as some of the Buddhists talk about. Instead, it's a more gentler, somewhat impartial stance of witnessing the flow of one's mental life. And Nepsis was always treated as a critical skill for practicing Christians. In fact, as a form of spiritual ascesis or exercise, its roots go back even further to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians. We can say that without attentiveness, there can be no authentic prayer. Now, one contemporary elder, spiritual elder, Elder Sergei, offers the following advice, which I think beautifully captures the function of Nepsis. Avoid letting your interior life go its own way, because inevitably it will end up on that slippery slope that leads to sin. No matter what the cost, you must resist drifting wherever the winds might take you. And I'd actually like to take this slippery slope quite literally. Today, the application of dynamical systems language in neurobiology models the operation of large-scale populations of brain neurons as collectively creating a sort of landscape along which neural activity flows. And similarly, because experience tracks brain physiology, there are now some really nice models of such state spaces of consciousness. Now, in this image, you can think of the sphere as indicating the trajectory of flows in brain activity. As neural activity unfolds in your brain, it tends to follow the grooves and patterns that have been passively laid down or inscribed into your neural pathways by your genetics and your experiences from your past. You could also think of the sphere as the luminous tip of your present point of awareness. It follows a certain trajectory so that the next sequence of thoughts or daydreams you have is not entirely random. It is being sculpted by the past history of emotionally tinged thoughts and memories. So if you just allow yourself to be passively carried by the flow of the mind stream, you're going to have a very high probability of visiting previously explored pathways. You're going to be thinking the same round of thoughts, feeling the same repertoire of emotions, and sort of going in a circle over and over again. Okay, so why is it important to activate a capacity for voluntary control of attention, the practice of Nepsis? Well, from a scientific point of view, conscious monitoring, sort of a mindfulness of your inner state, destabilizes the automaticity of those well-worn grooves. Awareness makes the overly rehearsed and well-oiled neuronal networks modifiable, susceptible to change. The ruts in our habitual ways of organizing ourselves begin to loosen up. They become softer, more pliable to change. To quote from one textbook in neurodynamics, to behave differently requires awareness of one's habitual behavior, and considerable deliberate effort must be expended to behave contrary to one's usual tendencies, since the neural pathways most readily activated are those that subserve habitual activity. So here's a very simple formula I'm proposing. When Nepsis is joined with inner prayer, it leads to positive or intentional neuroplasticity. The default position, which requires no effort and runs by itself, is that all the experiences we have, all the things we're exposed to, including the biological urges that impel us, these are all imprinting one set of grooves into our nervous system. The problem is we are completely passive to this action. We have little or no say in the process. By contrast, intentional neuroplasticity gives us some conscious agency or an ability to exercise our God-given free will. We can change the track that we are on and get onto a more healthy track. So we are gradually becoming a new creation, persons who are taking on the form of the image. Now, next, I'd like to consider the action of prayer as a healing of attention. So consider the slots that are around the perimeter of the circle as representing the contents of our consciousness. So these are thoughts, memories, fantasies, feelings, and all the permutations of these states. And these contents are passing into and out of our awareness like lapping waves, circling around the remembered past and an imagined future. And the tracks that they're on are conditioned by past emotional reinforcements. So we are tethered to our passions, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, avoiding discomfort. Ordinarily, our attention is completely absorbed and identified with these shifting contents of consciousness. Attention, which is a vital force, is drawn from our center and fused with the contents of our experience. In the understanding of the Philocolic Fathers, attention leaks out from us and gets dispersed in all these passing distractions. And they refer to this as attention following a linear path. From the center, it gets dispersed along the peripheral sideshow, sort of like having a leaky hose that's constantly losing water or energy. And as we begin a practice of inner prayer, that is, prayer joined with Nepsis, there is a very gradual redirection of this outward dispersal of attention. Now, in the initial stages of praying, the words of the prayer begin to act as an anchor or a new expanding center of gravity that counteracts the regular dispersion that's usually happening. And what the prayer does on a psychological level is sort of like a foghorn that's calling on this vital force of attention, that recalling it back from the periphery into the center. The Philokalia calls this the circular path of attention. So if you think of attention as a vector force, it now reorients. As prayer progresses, rather than being invested in just the contents of awareness, there's a reservoir of free attention that begins to develop, and it concentrates into a single pointedness. And simultaneously with this, there is a continual returning of awareness to the present moment and away from being lost in past memories or future fantasies. So prayer is presumably quieting that agitated default mode network. Experientially, on a psychosomatic level, we can actually feel this as an ingathering into a kind of dimensionless center point in the core of our being, a shifting in the center of gravity as our habitual place of resting attention begins migrating from the cranium down approximately into the heart area and then radiating out from the heart area. To go back to the neurodynamics, I'm suggesting that prayer promotes neuroplasticity of this landscape. So initially, the landscape is riddled with these pits or depressions where neural activity gets trapped. And we say that these valleys in the neuronal landscape have low transition energy, meaning it takes no effort to get there. Neural activity and by extension experience just sort of goes there on its own momentum. You could think, for example, of Evagrius's 8 thoughts as corresponding to very low transition energy centers in our neuronal landscape. And by contrast, we also have these very high hills to climb, and they have a high transition energy barrier in order to get there. It takes a lot of voluntary effort to try and scale these mountains in the landscape. And this might represent the angelic form of being, where we are able to witness events in our life from a more tranquil, spiritual witnessing presence, and exhibit unconditional love and forgiveness of others. So I'm proposing that over a long period of time, Nepsis and inner prayer, joined with the sacramental life, gradually melt down the solidity of these entrenched neuronal networks and begin to reconfigure them into a new mold. We become less and less prone to passive capture by the passions. Some of our deep-set dysfunctional patterns of thinking, feeling, reacting are being relaxed as the system settles into a new organization that is conducive to greater psychological flexibility, increased psychospiritual transparency, and greater overall integration. The default mode network becomes less isolated. It is reintegrated or welcomed back into communion with other large-scale neuronal networks that embed the organism into the wider expanse of the body and the world. The antagonistic sort of seesaw relationship that the default mode network normally has with these so-called task-positive networks that situate us in the present moment is slowly being reconciled. A new default center is emerging, a divinized psychobiological mode of organization. But for a long time, maybe our whole life, we're faced with this condition known as bistability in dynamic system science, oscillation. With the assistance of grace, we're carving this new path forward, but the old patterns never really completely go away. So the new pattern has a shallow basin of attraction compared to a very wide basin of attraction of the old man, the old animalistic patterns. So we're now set up for competition between the new and the old. In moments of high stress, a lot of temptation, there is a really fierce battle because the system has a preference to snap back into its familiar grooves. This preference for familiarity is called hysteresis in dynamic systems language. So this requires much patience and forbearance because we are guaranteed to fail and fall in and out of communion. So let's just go back to this depiction just for a little bit. We see that the outer perimeter of the circle is entangled with the more conceptual, abstract layers of the mind and self. These are thickly enmeshed with verbal networks. Those regions of our mind are rich in what is called counterfactual processing. They're mostly based in imagination and constructed narratives rather than being grounded in reality. But below this, we have experiences of self and world that are much more direct and unmediated by a thick fog of cognitive representations. They're much closer to life itself. So one of the things that happens as prayer matures is that there is a growing degree of embodiment happening as prayer becomes more alive and less mechanical. Cognitive fusion, mistaking thoughts of reality for reality itself, is undermined in favor of a more playful, spontaneous, flexible way of being. Okay, this leads me to the last component of our cycle, that's embodiment. Now, Father Meletius Weber said something really interesting. He said that in the Orthodox tradition, properly understood, prayer is actually a matter of going deeper and deeper into the body and not of trying to escape from the body. Similarly, I'd like to recommend to people to read Father Stephen's book on prayer life and our embodiment. And I take this stuff really seriously because neuroscience now tells us that the brain maintains a hierarchical representation of our selfhood. It's sort of like a tree, where the roots and the foundations of the tree are anchored in something that we'll call the deep self, also referred to as a minimal or embodied self. And this self is much more rooted in the intelligence of the body. It's integrating inputs from the gastrointestinal, the cardiovascular, and other visceral systems. And this deep self is in continuous communion with the energies coming from the world around us. It connects us with the freshness of the present moment. We contact the cosmos through our incarnation. The upper branches of the tree of selfhood we call our mental or autobiographical self. Very conceptual, very abstract, all mixed up with language. The body as experienced by the mental self is just another physical object. The body is a lived experience from the perspective of the deep self. From the perspective of the deep self, it experiences directly and not through the medium of cognitive representations. Its mode of knowing is unitive, holistic, and immediate. And patristic anthropology knows obviously much more about this than science. And we're approaching the nous here, the deep heart, which knows through this faculty of aesthesis, where there is a conscious sensibility of divine energies. And this is much closer to an ineffable feeling of knowing. So just to wrap all of this up, we could say that our starting position is one of disorganization. We contact reality in a sort of inverted perspective. Instead of entering into contact with reality through our deepest, most true and authentic self, we get it the other way around. This pyramid here is inverted, and it's meant to symbolize that we experience life largely through the distorting prism of the unsure, fragile mental self. The default mode network becomes excessively isolated, and we slip into a hall of mirrors experience of reality. Our experience is fractured between self and world. We're always trying to make the outer world satisfy our whims, but it's never going to work. It's always going to fail. And this is the new center of gravity that Theosis is leading us to. It induces a real conversion in our psychosomatic way of being, situating us in creation from the contact point of the deep self, the self that coheres with Christ. Now, rather than experiencing a fissure between an individual, a separate self, and the world, we have an increasingly conscious experience of ongoing communion with reality. Reality discloses itself as a luminous, living network of here and now interactions encompassing the entire cosmos. The foreground, which is a personal nexus of consciousness, enters into a dynamic dance or a perichoresis with a beneficent and caring background, sort of like the prodigal son returning to the loving embrace of the Father. So let me just go back to the metaphor of the river. A life of ascesis is a conscious stewardship of our interior ecology. The river gradually resumes its pristine transparency. Its ability to reflect back and become a mirror for the beauty of the world around us is restored as its natural property. And this interior asceticism over time also increases our transparency and receptivity to the influence of grace and God's uncreated energies. Dumitru Staniloe says that the saints are characterized by a remarkable degree of natural presence and transparency of these energies. In the living example of the saint, he wrote, the divine consciousness and the human consciousness become transparent to each other, co-inherent. By affirming that this mutual penetration without confusion occurs between God and humanity, Christianity has revealed the unfathomable and indefinable mystery of the human person and his consciousness. So, Theosis magnetizes us toward God, brings us toward increased communion, greater transparency, intentional responsiveness, wholeness, and freedom. And the other path in life heads toward isolation, psychospiritual opacity, mechanical reactivity, fragmentation, and loss of freedom. And it's up to each of us which path we try to be on at any given moment in our life. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, so I'd like to invite also Dr. Hurt, Professor Hurt, to come up to the stage.
suppose in 5 years you can mimic such an experience with a virtual reality headset and an AI version of your spouse. And it similarly stimulates that part of the brain. Well, what it's missing is the nature or reality of the object, which is a big part of the question. And in ascetical terms, I think that connects with the whole topic of discernment of spirits. Second aspect of the empirical question is the very observation phenomena. So the very fact that you're wired in a clinic, what does that do to the meditation itself? To return to my example, if I'm out for my anniversary dinner with my wife and a certain part of the brain is being stimulated, that's one thing. But if you had a camera there and a whole production crew filming our conversations, it's going to alter the very nature of the experience, the spontaneity, all kinds of things. So I wonder if the problem of the meditation being affected by observation is somewhat inherent and intractable to the point where we can't actually say that much about meditation per se, only a certain kind of observed phenomenon. And then the theological question has to do with, I suppose, what we might describe in Western terms as a certain Pelagian concern with expecting grace and holiness to show up, as it were, for the camera. A sense of, if I'm praying to God sincerely for God's presence in my life, that's one thing. But if I'm doing it in effect to try to achieve a measurable result under clinical conditions, is there a certain concern, both in the relationship with God itself, and could there even be concerns of a certain kind of profanation, as though, when Moses is told, take your shoes from off your feet, this is holy ground. We can't imagine Moses or, say, St. Anthony the Great saying, first let me put on my camera so we can record the experience. So I'm just curious some of your response to that, but thank you very much for the talk. And if Brother Theophan has any responses, that'd be grateful as well.
Thank you. And maybe if I lose my train of thought, you can remind me because there was a lot there. So first, the object of meditation. I thought the way you unpacked that was interesting by giving an example that had to do with memory. So I do think we can, that is empirically tractable, right, to compare actual experiences with remembered experiences. So we can look at what's the difference in brain activity between one and the other. So there are some ways of getting at some aspects of your question, but I think your more fundamental question gets back to the point that I made about reductive eliminatives, that you're not going to either confirm or disconfirm that an experience is an experience of God. That's a way of fundamentally saying empirical study will not get at the object. Second question, I would put in terms of ecological validity. That's the way it gets discussed. So if the context is an artificial one, doesn't that transform the character of the activity and therefore distort the findings? And that is absolutely a concern. And it's one reason why efforts are made to find one mode of exploration that might be lab-based and another that might not be lab-based, and compare them and see, well, what are the differences here? So again, there are ways of mitigating the problems associated with the artificial context. The other thing we might want to say is that with really experienced meditators, they might not be thrown off by the artificial context in the way that most of us would be, right? So that's kind of an interesting question as well, to think about how that's part of what is being developed, is the capacity for control of attention even under weird circumstances. Remind me again briefly of the theological question.
Just a sense of whether there might be a kind of theological concern in Western terms analogous to Pelagianism, with expecting a kind of God-on-demand experience.
Right, thank you. Well, I do think that that is one of the reasons that there is sometimes resistance
forms of non-dual practice, for example, can alleviate that antagonism. And there's a new organization that happens that becomes effortless over time, but initially requires effort. And similarly, in the Orthodox tradition, you have this sort of notion of the maturation of prayer. That the early stages of prayer probably are very top-down and sort of mechanical. There's very sort of conscious intention to have a repetition of words, for example, where the rest of the body may not be very involved. And how over time that dorsal attention network becomes less necessary actually, because we're building a new man in Christ is being formed, a new person in Christ. And at a neurobiological level, I think that's reflected in this alleviating of this tension that normally exists in this sort of seesaw relationship. So when you get to effortless meditation, you no longer require that very heavy exertion of top-down effort. It becomes spontaneous. It's just who you are. Someone mentioned yesterday, our life is meant to become a prayer, and I think that's reflected in that permeation of starting from a very subconscious directed to an increasing openness and receptivity in the more mature phases. So I think it follows a longitudinal trajectory. It would be, I'm more interested in sort of videographic analysis of that kind rather than group differences. But a single person, as they're committed over the span of decades of life, how are they being transformed from the inside? I think there's less we can glean from sort of snapshots of having a control group.
Thank you both for your excellent talks. My name's Joel. I'd like to bring both of you into conversation with a third, if I might. Last year I had the pleasure of reading a very rich, deep study I recommend to everyone who's interested in the topic of the brain and our life in Christ. Jessica Wright, Care of the Brain in Early Christianity, published in 2022. She lays out something that quite surprised me, which is that in pre-Christian Greek philosophy, there was no set opinion on where in the body the highest faculties of the human being resided. There certainly was a brain-centric or encephalocentric view that the brain was where the nous is, or the highest faculty. But there were others who rejected that, and they said, no, well, certainly the brain has some function in our sense perception, but it's the heart that is really in charge of the hegumenon, or the rational faculty. And then there were other schools of thought that tried to broker the difference between the two and said, well, there's some kind of holistic thing going on between the brain and the heart. You find this in Galen, who actually did original work on the ventricles in the brain and hypothesized that the pneuma in the ventricles had some kind of psychosomatic engagement with the rest of the pneuma in the body, and that is where the highest faculty was. So when Christianity comes on the scene, it does not have a set medical model from which to follow, and there would have had to be choices for them made. And you see this in Jessica Wright's study through various writers, such as Augustine, who have to make choices about how to engage with the science of their day. I won't point you to this common question into those details, just to say that in this area, as with so many areas of early Christianity science, the pillars of orthodoxy sometimes implicitly or explicitly endorse a particular scientific view. There are times when they explicitly reject the dominant scientific point of view, and there are times when they actually introduce something that is completely new. And from our perspective, we look back and we think, well, the science of their day was rather laughable. So a little bit of a meta question, 2,000 years from now, our science might be thought as rather laughable as well. But we see, though, those in the 4th century, 5th century who were doing the same kind of activity that you two are. What strategies have you two adopted as you try to engage with the science of our day? Thank you.
every sacred tradition in the world, I believe, holds to that. In the Sufi tradition, the indigenous American tradition, Tibetan Buddhists, they all say the mind is actually the heart in the news. And what is in the brain is discursive daimia, as they call it in the Philippines. Discursive thoughts, the center of that is the brain. But that is not our highest faculty, actually. It has often been treated as our highest faculty, particularly in the Western world, and after Descartes. But it is not. For the most part, contemporary neuroscience is completely permeated by a reductive, limited materialism that completely ignores the invisible qualitative dimension of what it means to be a human. So it's no surprise that they completely miss it. But they are now discovering there is an entire nervous system in the gut. They're discovering an exquisite neural system around the heart. So there's a lot of interest in neurocardiac coupling. And yet, contemporary secular scientists have no idea what it's about. So they're beginning to identify the anatomy and the anatomical pathways. In terms of what that actually means from the perspective of inner experience, we're much stick with the fathers because they know, because they live it. And I think that's the point I was trying to get at. These are meant to be lived realities rather than objectified realities. And that's not to discount the role of intellectual knowledge and sort of discursive mind, but to put it in its proper place, which is to be subservient to the heart. It's meant to be a servant of the heart, not the other way around. Science has a lot of catching up to do, but what I'm seeing, well, I left science to become monastic because I was frustrated in part by this. But I am seeing encouraging glimmers of a sea shift that's happening in the scientific worldview that is coming to appreciate the holistic nature of reality, and that you have to address the qualitative, invisible dimension. Otherwise, you're not dealing with a whole human being. You're dealing with a caricature of a human being.
I'll just we're having mic problems. I'll just comment briefly on the second part of what you had to say, which I think was to invite us to think more generally about science-engaged theology, or how do we go about thinking with science. And I think it's hard to do well. It's hard to do well because it's tempting to just latch on to a little bit of science without understanding it very well. It takes a lot of time to learn the theology and learn the science and so on. So it's helpful to do it in a kind of focused way that allows you to get enough expertise to understand what you're talking about. That's one thing. Another thing to say is that, in science changes over time. And the good thing about science is that it does engage in self-corrective processes. So it doesn't really embarrass a scientist that much to look back and say, oh, X, Y, and Z was wrong, because they anticipate that is the nature of the process in self-correcting. So that means that when you are engaged theologically with some bit of science, you need to engage in the way it treats it as a set of hypotheses that's going to be tested and going to be refined, and it's going to look different in 50 years. And there is a danger in our culture because of the kind of high respect that we have for science, that we put it up on a pedestal and we think that we've got to adjust ourselves to the science. And that's a mistake, but the conversation can be a very different.
Just one thing I would add is, I think there's at least 3 avenues to knowledge. The first is empirical, which is what science is sort of based on. The second is sort of the use of human logic, a priori. And both of these are the 2 pillars of sort of Western science. And the third dimension is what you might call participatory knowledge, or knowledge through community, which you cannot communicate through any other means other than being in community. It's not a spectator sport. You have to enter into it. Our contemplative traditions deal with that form of knowledge, which transforms the human being. Our science deals with the first 2 types of knowledge, which are wonderful. A lot of what we have in modern medicine and modern technologies do masters are masters of that third way of knowing, which is not really, it's just a blank hole for most contemporary scientists. Like I said, science studies the human as a biocomputer, but we know that we have logoi, and we were made in the image of God, and that's not something you can quantify.
We have two last questions, one here and one in the back, and then we will continue the discussion at the break.
Thank you both for the rich talks. I have a question for Professor Hurt about categorization. So you gave some very helpful ways to think about the problem of profaning or hollowing out these practices, but there are real benefits we can see from scientific studies. But of course, another concern from the tradition, as you know, is direction or guidance. They take place in the context of discipleship, community, or an elder, or so on. So I wonder if you could speak to that ethical problem. It's not just profanation or hollowing of practices in the context, but the social context, as it were.
Absolutely. This came up at a conversation and raised some point so we have this turn toward spirituality, spiritual practices, and for a lot of young people, that's being mediated through digital technology. It's a matter of finding the right app, and you're going to use your app for meditation. So your mental health is being destroyed by your addiction to digital technology, and you're going to address that through another digital technology. And yes, I think that's a problem. I think deep part of the hurting that we see around us has to do with social isolation, and I don't think we're going to heal that by remedies of being socially isolated. Again, how do we then move forward? I think we work with what we have. So again, it might be that one's introduction to meditative practice is through an app, and then one realizes that you've hit a wall and you're not able to progress further, and maybe that leads you, if there are opportunities out there, that leads you into something that would be a relational practice. So, very important.
Final question?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for sharing. This was wonderful. My question is just geared for Brother Theophan. So in that moment that we find ourselves falling into our increasing cortisol, as I like to say, we are caught like this crisis, we're enslaved by our passions, but I like to say we're also enslaved by our hormones. So those rise and falls. What advice do you have in that moment that we have that activation that we can't control? What do we do to get more control?
Yeah, I think Nepsis, awareness, becoming aware of, just becoming aware of it, not trying to change it, because the thing is that we can change it. And all attempts to change it will backfire eventually. It's only grace that can actually change it. But by becoming aware of it, we're inviting the light of, from a Christian perspective, we're inviting the light of Christ to enter and do the healing. And by becoming aware, one of the questions was observation itself changes something. This was a fundamental discovery of, for example, Gestalt psychotherapy, is that in order to change a human process, you bring awareness to it, and awareness itself is healing. And so just noticing these things, noticing the lobismo, calling for help, gradually over time, it's not going to happen overnight, but gradually over time, it takes more and more air out of the tire. It takes the momentum out of it, and allows you to get on the new track. And I think being patient with ourselves and kind to ourselves, in the sense of what I talked about, for a very long time, there's this oscillation. We were talking about this yesterday in the talk of seeing Isaac, that there's these two moments where we notice our brokenness and our fallenness, and then we oscillate, and we receive grace. And through the infusion of energy, we're able to sort of scale, we're able to sort of get over that one little problem maybe, and then it's the next thing. So there's this sort of like twofold dynamic, and that requires just a lot of patience and forbearance. So awareness, being patient, and being kind to ourselves and others.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers. I apologize for interrupting this wonderful discussion.
Our next speaker is Father Stephen Muse. He is a bivocational priest who directs the Clergy in Kairos program at Pastoral Institute in Columbus, Georgia, a personalized week-long crisis intervention, stress, and wellness intensive retreat for clergy and spouse renewal. He holds joint appointments as a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science and Bioethics and Medical Humanities at Mercer University School of Medicine, and is faculty with the St. Francis Hospital Psychiatry Residency Program, serving on the Clinical Competency Committee. He has authored or edited a number of books for both adults and children. His work has been translated into Russian, Greek, Swedish, Serbian, and Romanian. He served on the Assembly of Canonical Bishops Pastoral Praxis Committee and the OCA Task Force on Spiritual Abuse. He is a past president of the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion, and serves on their advisory board. Please join me in welcoming Father Stephen Muse.
I'm very grateful to be here, and I thank you for the invitation. When Professor Young, I was saying, well, I don't know if I'll be able to offer something. She said, can't you talk for 50 minutes? So I said, well, yes. Then I realized I only have 30, so that's what I'm worried about the most. I like to go to Greece, and there's a monastery I go to there, and I always get a zinger from one of the nuns. And the last time I was there, a nun I didn't even know said, there's two kinds of ignorance. She said, one is when you know a lot about one thing and you don't know how ignorant you are. And the other is when you know a lot about a lot of things and you know how ignorant you are. So having been here yesterday and today, I feel very, very ignorant, but I'm going to offer you what I can, some reflections. So I need that sign. Okay. First, a preamble of distinguishing spiritual and psychological, which I think is essential, especially for Western discussions of orthodoxy and psychology. The theological anthropology and neptic ascetical practices of the Orthodox Christian Church constitute a unique body of accumulated wisdom acquired in the struggle for sanctification within the sacramental life of the Church. Elder Emilia Nos emphasizes the paradox of love at the heart of this struggle. Quote, genuine love for God is the generative cause of undistracted prayer, and undistracted prayer is the generative cause of the love of God. Observed from the psychological perspective, both orthodox ascetical and contemplative practices and modern advances in the treatment of trauma unfold relationally, and they aim at restoring psychosomatic unity fragmented by sin or trauma. Progress in both areas involves moving beyond monologue, which kinodoxia is a wonderful word, patristic word, empty glory, self-esteem, the self that is not hid with Christ and God, but the objectified self that we can never actually encounter except in and through communion, as Brother Theophan spoke about before. Regarded from the ontological perspective, all psychophysiological accompaniments to noetic prayer described by the Neptic Fathers regarding stillness and concentrated attention to breathing are secondary to acquiring humility from repentance and the struggle to be obedient to commandments of Christ, which are existential responses to the initiative of divine grace. Elder Sergei of von Vase points out, Christ did not come to give us a technique, but to teach us the ways of repentance. In contrast to psychotherapy, the ascetical struggle for stillness, silence, and concentration in prayer are lived out in the service of sanctification and not with the aim of achieving physical or psychological health and well-being. Repentance and obedience in response to divine grace are the foundation of all neptic ascetical practices. St. Sophrony explains, quote, we accept Christ as absolute truth, as God the Creator and God the Savior, His commandments are the uncreated light of divinity, and the essence of Orthodox asceticism is the effort to make the commandments the sole law of our being, both temporal and eternal. Elder Sergei summarizes the intent and purpose of the Philogalic Fathers this way. This practice can only be effective in the church by the power of grace and that the sacraments communicate to us. Outside the church and without battling the passions, the prayer has neither meaning nor value. Removed from its ecclesiastical context, the Jesus prayer, for example, easily morphs into a relaxation response or a Christian mantra used for self-calming, the same as various yogic and meditational practices adapted from other religions which have grown popular in recent years. St. Sophrony has spoken very clearly regarding the importance of the unity of dogma, sacrament, and ascetical practice in his discussion of how the aim and end result of Hindu and Buddhist forms of meditative practice differ from Orthodox Christian prayer. He writes, all other paths deflect our mind from the personal interrelationship between God and the one who prays into the realm of an abstract transpersonal absolute, into an impersonal asceticism. In diverting our mind from all images, meditation can afford us a sense of tranquility, of peace, of release from time and space, but there's no feeling of standing before a personal God. It is not real prayer, face to face. This can lead to a state where one who is entranced by meditation will be content with the psychic results of such experiments, and worst of all, perception of the living God, the personal absolute, will be alien to him. By avoiding reductionism or conflation of ontological and psychological domains related to the uncreated, created energies distinction, we may consider ways in which advances in understanding brain-body dynamics and the development of somatic, effective clinical therapies in the treatment of trauma begin to converge with phenomenological observations of the neptic ascetical fathers, confirming one another. Just as trauma therapists recognize that cognitive understanding alone cannot change deeply embedded implicit memory systems, the neptic fathers observe that prayer that is not united with the heart, the psychosomatic core, does not prove transformative and is more vulnerable to the deceptions of unreality inherent in kenodoxia, which I think syncs very exactly with what Fathers was giving us in his neurobiological understanding. St. Mark the Ascetic observes, when our mind and flesh are not in union, our state deteriorates. St. Sophrony adds, prayer unites the whole man, his mind, his heart, even his body, blended into one act. He says, for the Fathers, the link between body and soul is so intimate that all inner attitudes must take shape in an external behavior. Not only do such behaviors express feelings and dispositions of the soul, but they allow these dispositions to truly fulfill themselves. A feeling, which is a movement of the soul, engages the depth of the human being only if it becomes incarnate in a gesture, if it's embodied, a posture or a bodily practice. A spiritual life that is purely internal remains cerebral, conceptual, or imaginative. End of quote. Psychosomatic unity involves neurobiological and psychological realities that are central to both psychotherapy and the neptic fathers' ascetical practices. St. Maximus the Confessor observes, divine grace cannot actualize the illumination of spiritual knowledge unless there's a natural faculty capable of receiving that illumination. But that faculty itself cannot actualize the illumination without grace, which God bestows. So there's no natural elevation into transfiguration. We have to have intercourse with the person of God in Christ at the nexus of his hypostasis, which unites the uncreated and the created. Neurobiological advances in the study of the brain over the past 30 years have given birth to new fields of investigation, such as epigenetics, the importance of the microbiome culture, and recognition of the interrelationship among the brain and the enteric and cardiovascular nervous systems. These three interactive neurohormonal systems substantiate the psychosomatic foundations congruent with the phenomenological descriptions of the Philokaleic Fathers. Discovery of the brain's neuroplasticity and ability to heal itself, along with recognition of the interactive nonverbal intelligence of the body, has led to integrative approaches to healing trauma that emphasize the importance of engaging proprioceptive sensation. And I would note on your slides, you talked about Nepsis with thoughts and images, but it's also the sensation, the felt sense. That's in the Hebrew ta'am, taste is the word that's translated into Greek for discernment. So there is an inner taste of all the qualities that begin to give an understanding of whether something comes from the demonic or from grace. This promotes integration of the left and right hemispheric processes of the brain, which involve nonverbal bottom-up somatic interventions that involve attention to the autonomic nervous system's activation and the affective states which are involved in trauma, which are imprinted kind of like a photograph and then get triggered again and again. Advances in trauma therapy confirm the patristic emphasis on drawing the mind, the nous, inside the body. Many of the fathers speak about this as a foundation for prayer. Otherwise, being heads on stilts, we are not going to have grace activate us. It has to come down, and the nous does. A continual and nepsis, or sobriety, a continual fixing and halting of thought at the entrance of the heart. And I go back to what Elder Emiliano said. He makes it very starkly in one of his books. If you're distracted, you don't love God. If you're distracted in prayer. Now, people get freaked out by that, but this is true. Now, what can we say? None of us love God that much. And so we will be distracted because we don't have perfect love. And this is humbling, and we have to stay with it. St. Macarius of Egypt adds, understanding cannot enter you unless you practice stillness. Apart from psychosomatic unity, prayer remains psychic, in the head or the imagination, and it's devoid of existential encounter from the personal core, which recalls Jesus' admonition, don't use vain repetitions as the heathens do, for they think they will be heard for their many words. A lot of times people wonder, well, if you're not supposed to use vain repetitions, how can you do the Jesus prayer? Because it's not a vain repetition. It's a personal cry that begins to move to the center. Maximus the Confessor emphasizes the centrality of psychosomatic unity. Any desire for God, this is him, that does not mindfully engage the senses and the material world has no reality in the soul, and it can only be a phantom. Just as God descended to man through the flesh, so does man's ascent to God involve not a rejection of matter, but a necessary passage through matter, not a rejection of the world, but a recognition of its true nature and purpose. So the tropos, the mode of being of our natural being, is transformed. And that was a beautiful chart, so clear, that you put up there, that really articulates that from the ground up. This unit, okay, so it is now recognized that the heart communicates with the brain through a variety of pathways other than what were once thought. The vagus nerve, which is 80% afferent, carries information from the heart and the other internal organs to the brain. Neuronal activity of the microbiomes in the gut are affected by the brain and in turn change the quality of emotions and mental states. There are 100 million neurons in the gut, 40,000 or so in the heart. This is an interactive pathway, and so as St. Macarius speaks of the inner weather, of the background of our inner life, this is all affecting that. And we know in trauma, many people have ulcerative colitis and things like this that are coming from this. We know epigenetically that when the cortisol and adrenaline have been hit again and again by neglect and abuse in childhood, that the epigenetic effects later in adult will produce these kinds of things. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, diabetes increase 400% because of the markers on the genetic code being turned on by those conditions of not being safe. And there are things that can be done about that, and one of the things is the practices that we're talking about here can help turn those markers off, as has been alluded to already. The unity of all of this, mind and body, is such that Candace Pert, the former chief of brain chemistry at National Institute of Mental Health, who discovered the neuropeptide system in the body, she says, I can no longer make a strong distinction between the brain and the body. Research suggests a need to start thinking about how consciousness can be projected into various parts of the body. A finding that lends biological credence to St. Porphyrios' observation that all sicknesses are psychosomatic. And it confirms the importance of Jean-Claude Larcher's observation that a person doesn't merely have a body, he or she is a body. Even though the person, as such, infinitely transcends bodily limits. This again is an emphasis on the mode or the tropos that changes our nature. The person is primary for us. According to St. Sophrony, to see one's sins is the beginning of contemplation. Prayer in sighs too deep for words, as in Romans, and the tears of repentance in confession are manifestations of mind-body unity in response to divine grace at a personal level. In a parallel manner, recognizing the importance of mind-body unity in evoking deeper affective states, trauma therapists now make extensive use of the somatic narrative, that is, the gesture, posture, prosody, facial expressions, eye gaze, movement that are arguably more significant than the story told by words. I'll give you, how much time, what time is it now? How long have I gone? 15 minutes. Oh, I'm on page 6. Oh, I can't ad-lib. All right. Okay. St. Maximus the Confessor identifies the etiology of spiritual illness as being the result of self-love and an unpurified mind divided against itself by identification with the unreality of fantasy. This delusional state results in cutting our single human nature into many fragments, which fits perfectly with the understanding of trauma as having parts that are at war with each other and overcoming one another in terms of being triggered dissociative responses. Psychic fragmentation from sin disrupts the dialogos of communion by substituting the monologue of the false self in place of vulnerability and simplicity of dialogical reciprocity with God and other persons. There's really only the love and truth that is the person of Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, and there's monological kinodoxia. So I'm either learning to offer my life again and again and again in repentance and love in that relationship, or I am building a mausoleum and sticking Facebook pictures on it where I die in the monologue. By contrast, orthodox neptic practices are part of a lifelong struggle to achieve freedom from fragmentation created by the sinful passions. As St. Paul testifies, even with strong ascetical struggle and the help of divine grace, fragmentation by sin will exist until our last breath. And we need God's help beyond our own efforts, which I think of as Jacob's struggle with Christ as the fathers see him at the Jabbok River. The wounding we receive that is the blessing that recognizes we have been with God is the beginning defeat of the old man, but it goes on to our last breath. And Jacob's first blessing was cheated. He cheated to get that blessing, so he doesn't have a real blessing. His real blessing comes when he meets the unconquerable divine God and says, I won't give up until I get a blessing. So God says, okay, here it is. Elder Sergius emphasizes an important distinction about the difference between spiritual and psychological man. And he says, there are saints who are very nervous and who twitch. And there are saints who speak quite bluntly and who are very forward. Other saints are excessively slow in all that they do. And others have physical defects. In these people, the interior old man is conquered, but the old exterior man remains. These saints are not totally transfigured, and the old man continues to be visible on the exterior. And so we can mistake people who have begun to live a different life, even though there are signs that change in the body, as St. Sophrony spoke of, that have to be there. Psychotherapy attempts to heal the fragmentation of the body that's created by trauma, and this is what's happening on a larger ontological level that's affecting the biology with the Philokaleic fathers. I'm going to have to skip a lot here to meet my deadline. Let's see. Some of the things, we've talked about the research. Harold Koenig at Duke has used some what he calls healing prayer practice and researched that, which is about forgiveness and showing the effect of a process of learning to forgive and let go of where people are in contraction around a judgment with someone. And he's found some significant neurobiological changes by self-report and functional MRI, lots of improvement psychologically, and also growth of gray matter. So there's clearly the neuroplasticity of the brain has opened up all kinds of possibilities. I'm not going to name all the theories that do this now, but they all share an emphasis on increasing mindful awareness of proprioceptive sensation and attention to the internal somatic felt sense, which promotes increased capacity for emotional self-regulation. Someone asked about that. What do you do if you're excitable? Well, watchfulness includes grounding yourself in the sensation of your body. If the noose is inside, there is a different capacity to let go of something that's activated than if it's outside of it. So if someone's having a flashback or losing it with trauma, you ask them, where are you sitting? Can you feel the texture of the couch? What color is it? You bring them right back to their body, because if they're not inhabiting the body, they're shooting up like a rocket into a loss of their capacity for self-control, and it's way up in the noose is now completely captured in a hypnotic state by something that it is connected to. So all that the fathers teach is to free the noose from hypnosis. We could say that all passions and all traumatic affects and things are a form of hypnosis, in which the noose is glued to something and then it communicates to the body what would actually happen if we're asleep and we dream of falling and we jump, because our body is responding to the hypnosis of the hypnagogic realm. This is going on while we're awake in that state of sleep that Brother Theophan was speaking about. Now, in psychotherapy research, only 1% of it, according to meta-analysis, can be attributed to the medical method. In other words, it's not about techniques that bring something. Only 1%. What matters is relationship, trust, the person of the therapist. They even did one study of antidepressants, and they redid it, looking to see which psychiatrist gave the medicines. And what they found was, when they thought it was the medicine making the difference, they then found that it was a couple of psychiatrists who had such compassion and relationship with their patients that they were getting better. So it was a different variable that hadn't been recognized. Compassion is huge in terms of that relationship. However, there is a specific variable that appears to be a neurobiological link that underlies all therapy regardless of its theory. But it isn't something you can technique bring about. But if, regardless of which theory you're using, and out of a compassionate relationship, when the healing is activated, this is what will happen. So in 1997, researchers identified how long-standing implicit memory responses, that's unconscious, embedded in the body, disappeared completely and could not be re-invoked by the same conditions which originally created them, by utilizing chemical agents known to destroy unstable, unconsolidated synapses. But the synapses that were already consolidated and locked were not affected by it. This was a very interesting discovery, because that meant if they're open, change can happen. But why can't it happen when they're closed? So, further animal and human studies empirically demonstrated a 5-hour temporary reconsolidation window in which traumatic memory systems are vulnerable to change. Bruce Ecker and colleagues look for evidence of the unlocking and reconfiguring of these memory systems in the meta-analysis of studies. And what they found was if the memory is triggered and you have about 5 hours where it could be reconfigured, if you can find in them an affective response that has new memory of the reality. Like I had a patient who was in a church with a tornado. Her kids, she was in there, she survived, but she came to therapy because she was screaming at her children for little things. Stuff that she knew, this is crazy, what's the matter with me? So we did EMDR and she was totally well in 3 sessions because something occurred where that persisting traumatic embodied autonomic nervous system reaction, which is about survival. So she was yelling at her kids because she was trying to protect them, not consciously, but unconsciously. As soon as the awareness that she was no longer in the tornado got to the place where she had that memory, it erased it just like that. Now, it doesn't automatically have to have the same affective intensity, but and this is where it gets really beyond my pay grade, something happens that can slip in 1 second and completely change it. But sometimes it takes many, many shapings like that. And I think that fits with the long-term, work of prayer that's ultimately what we're going to do. But we know, and this is one of my main points I want to leave with us, is that the fathers pretty much agree, bring the nous into the body to begin prayer. The same happens in trauma. So, how much have I got now? 5 minutes, okay. All right, I'm going to skip to training of therapists and spiritual fathers, the last 2 pages. Although practices of ascetical theology and psychotherapy unfold along different ontological registers based on their relationship with divine grace, their orientation to the meaning and end of life, and participation in the sacramental mysteries of the Church, the shared neurobiological foundations and the importance of psychosomatic unity, and the necessity of sensitive, attentive, whole-person empathy and compassion in dialogical relationship has significant implications for training and formation of both spiritual fathers and psychotherapists. The most valued and important part of the counselor training program that I directed at the Pastoral Institute for 21 years was a group that we called Spiritual Roots. It began with a half hour of complete physical stillness, not moving a single muscle, in group together, breathing the Jesus prayer. I introduced this to them very slowly, first helping them be embodied and then gradually combining that with that Jesus prayer, followed by encouraging awareness at the end of the 30 minutes of the transition from this inner place of silent recollection to our ordinary fragmented awareness and reactions in the world together. I wanted them to be particularly aware of what happens when you leave the state of intercollectedness back to the normal world and see the hypnosis recurring and taking over in us, and how we're gripped by exactly what you described. I can't use your words, but that river that looks like I feel a lot, I guess. Over several years, this helped form both a communal recognition of our unity, uniqueness, and shared humanity in Christ, as well as experientially reveal the importance of having a small degree of freedom from the nous being identified with the contents of consciousness, whether external objects, internal sensations, thoughts, or mental pictures. Recognizing the presence of passions linked with countertransferential effects affecting the relationship is critical for the therapist and for the spiritual father, especially when the spiritual father is not well tutored and he's dealing with parishioners with serious trauma who envelop him in high-powered transferences which his own vulnerabilities can link up with. This group process proved to be life-transforming for the participants as it became clear that the act of offering care for others is inextricably related to the therapist's own healing and growth. The capacity to accompany others as a co-pilgrim on the path of healing and redemption is a function of being willing to be surprised and to welcome those encounters, which are always gifts, beyond the human ability to manipulate, manage, or control. The integrity and sustainment of the vocation of psychotherapy necessitates lifelong repentance and self-observation and dialogue with the other, who always remains beyond our experience of the known. So the act of the encounter with another human being is an act of repentance, because my experience will be corrected and changed by the otherness. So this over and over, an oscillation. And if I refuse the encounter with the other, I refuse Christ. Insofar as both ascesis and psychotherapy proceed from and aim toward the unity of the whole person, each requiring humility and the power of not knowing in order to encounter God and another human being freshly, so the training of therapists and spiritual fathers, I believe, benefits most from the replication of this with one another in the presence of God. A prayer that I call the Dialogos prayer captures for me the trilogical dimension of such encounters occurring at the nexus of psychology and ontology that are both known and unknown in this adventure. And it goes like this: Lord, love the other through me. Let me love the other through you, and be loved by you through the other. St. Gregory Palamas says if the spiritual father doesn't have any grace, and the confessee comes to him with the grace that brings him to confession and humility, the spiritual father will be healed by the confession that he hears. If it's the other way, it goes that way. Christ never leaves us without his grace, and we meet Christ. We meet Christ and we meet one another across the ontological bridge of Christ. And this is beyond science to be able to study. We can approach, but we will never know Christ in the scriptures or in the world by senses or reason, but only from anothen, from above, from the Holy Spirit. We can never, ever know the one who is life, love, and truth as an object. We will only know through surrender in the communion of love. Thank you.
Professor Carey Frederick Frost is an Orthodox Christian theologian who teaches at Western Washington University and Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. She is the author of the recent book on women in the Orthodox Church, Church of Our Granddaughters, book reviews editor for Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies, and chair of St. Phoebe Center of the Deaconesses. She lives in the Pacific Northwest and is the mother of 5 and the grandmother of 1. Please join me in welcoming.
Good morning or good afternoon, whatever it is we're in here. How is the sound? Okay, am I in a good position? Great. First of all, thank you for including me in this conference. I thank the organizers and all of you here. I personally have found this to be one of the most consistently interesting and rich conferences I have ever been to. I have written pages and pages of notes, so thank you to all of you for the gift of this experience. I want to tell you just a little bit about my background before I give you my talk, which is that as an undergraduate, I studied Tibetan Buddhism. First of all, I grew up in the Orthodox Church. I grew up in a Carpatho-Russian parish in West Virginia, and I had the fortune of being taught the Jesus prayer at a young age. Then I went and I did my undergraduate work, studied Tibetan Buddhism, spent some time in Tibet, and studied contemplative practices in that setting. And then over time, I have engaged more in the contemplative tradition of the Christian East, as well as gotten interested in the mindfulness movement and its emergence from its Buddhist roots. So I'm trying to bring all of these things to bear. Okay, so I would like to begin by relating my observations from teaching a contemplative traditions class at Western Washington University, a state university. Most of my students are a couple generations removed from any sort of religious background and are often contemptuous of organized religion and especially Christianity. At the beginning of class, when I ask how many of them have been taught modern mindfulness techniques, they all raise their hands. At this point, every one of them raises their hands. They tell me places where they've encountered these mindfulness practices vary, some in therapeutic settings, some in stress reduction efforts in their public schools, from advertising on the internet, and very rarely are any of them aware of the Buddhist roots of these practices. So the ubiquity of these practices, as well as their disconnection from Buddhism, is a testimony to the topic of my paper, which is the laicization and transformation of contemplative practices. In recent times, as we've heard, contemplative practices from the Buddhist and Eastern Christian traditions have, to different degrees and in different manners, moved from the monastery to the living room. They began in monastic settings, and now they are popularized and practiced by non-monastic lay people. The laicization process within Buddhism has, among other things, produced the aforementioned mindfulness movement, a non-religious, consumer-driven, and health-related distillation of some Buddhist meditation techniques and practices. The incredible popularity of the mindfulness movement in turn has influenced its parent tradition of Buddhism, shifting some of Buddhism's concerns and altering its practices. So because the Buddhist tradition is further down this road of laicization and popularization than Eastern Christianity, an interfaith comparison is possible and I believe fruitful. So first I will describe in a little bit of detail the laicization of Buddhist practices, and then I will think about the laicization of Eastern Christian practices and what we might learn from the Buddhist example. Since the primary concern and expertise of our conference is Christian contemplative practices, I'm going to necessarily spend a little more time about the history of Buddhist contemplative practice. The Buddhist contemplative practice of meditation is largely derived from the earliest ethical precepts of Buddhism, the Eightfold Path, which includes a plan for how to detach from the world in order to reach enlightenment and ultimately nirvana, the release from the cycle of rebirth. Number 7 on this path is right mindfulness, which comes from the Pali term sati, smriti in Sanskrit. In this context, right mindfulness involves cultivating one's rightly ordered attention in order to work towards enlightenment. And again, it's part of there's 7 other parts to this path. This is just one. Over time, meditation practices to promote this quality of right mindfulness were developed across different Buddhist traditions, but always in a monastic, world-renouncing environment. In the monastic environment, even there, only a small and select group of Buddhists practiced meditation. In comparison, in traditional Buddhism, most Buddhist practitioners engaged in other things: ritual visits to the temple, prostrations, incense lighting, swinging of prayer wheels, and circumambulation of sacred space. These activities certainly have a contemplative aspect to them, but they were understood differently. They were understood as merit building, as improving one's chances for a better rebirth. So they were different from meditation practices in both manner and intention and origin. These contemplative practices and ritual actions have changed as Buddhism has taken root in North America. Now, I could also add Western Europe into this, but I know more about the North American context, so I'm going to speak to it. Change is, of course, always the case. With religious experience and traditions, they adapt as they move through time and space. Priorities and practices change organically, but something different is happening now. The manner and rate of change is pretty extraordinary in the contemporary North American context. There have long been Buddhist immigrants coming from traditionally Buddhist cultures to North America, but the change to which I'm referring is motivated by the late 20th and early 21st embrace of Buddhism in North America by people that do not have a traditional Buddhist background. Many observers have noted that the most remarkable change in North American Buddhism is the laicization of Buddhist contemplative practice of meditation. So no longer is Buddhist meditation the domain of elite monks, but it is now taught and practiced by lay people. The lay-run retreat center has really replaced the monastery here in North America. There are many factors at play in this laicization of Buddhism, not the least of which is North America is not a monastic culture, but there are also other forces of unprecedented scale and kind operating and contributing to this laicization that are unique to our contemporary setting. To name just a few, the type and pace of communication and media, the pressures of the marketplace and consumerism, the proclivity for cultural chauvinism, extraction, and appropriation, the individualism that defines the modern era, and the perennialism and syncretism that often accompany pluralism. Each of these forces, and there's others I haven't named, affect and accelerate the laicization of Buddhism, but what I'm most interested for today is another force, which is scientism. So I'm defining scientism as an epistemology based in the conviction that science and the scientific method are the best and most accurate way to render the truth about the world and reality. Scientism is a vernacular, as we've said a couple times, welcomed around the globe. We love our evidence-based discourse. In its power and its omnipresence, scientism is therefore critical to the laicization and mainstreaming of Buddhist practices. Scientism is influenced and accelerated by these previously named forces of consumerism and so forth, and scientism is aligned with secular and modernist ideals, and it plays right into the larger culture's growing suspicion of anything religious. The massive laicization of Buddhism combined with a shift in orientation to scientism in the modern North American setting gave birth to the mindfulness movement. The mindfulness movement is, to use a definition from the mindfulness scholar Jeff Wilson, the widespread and growing collection of people who practice, and especially those who actively promote, techniques of awareness derived originally from the Buddhist cultures of Asia. The mindfulness movement often ignores, obscures, or downplays its Buddhist roots, but they are clear, and the underlying epistemology of the mindfulness movement is scientism. One example will illustrate these points. The work of Buddhist practitioner and really the father of the mindfulness movement, Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. While on a Buddhist retreat in 1979, Kabat-Zinn had a vision of creating a system of meditation without any unnecessary impediments, those are his words, from Buddhism, in order to offer people who would otherwise never encounter Buddhism these practices. Thus inspired, he created mindfulness-based stress reduction, commonly referred to as MBSR. He defined the quality of mindfulness being cultivated in MBSR as, quote, awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Initially, Kabat-Zinn designed MBSR for healthcare workers to assist them handling workplace stress, but MBSR was quickly offered in all manner of settings. Over the past 40-odd years, MBSR has become the gold standard of the mindfulness movement and the most studied program of the mindfulness movement. MBSR consists of meditation practices drawn directly from Buddhist forms of meditation, but they are entirely stripped of any religious or spiritual language, tone, or themes. MBSR has led to many other courses in mindfulness and expressions of the mindfulness movement over time. And mindfulness movement is now so thoroughly scientized and thus secularized, so thoroughly removed from its Buddhist origins that there are many examples of MBSR classes being offered by Christian churches or Jewish temples. Kabat-Zinn speaks about his work this way, quote, The intention and approach behind MBSR were never meant to exploit, fragment, or decontextualize the Dharma meaning the Buddhist teachings and understandings of reality, but rather to recontextualize the Dharma within the frameworks of science, medicine, including psychiatry and psychology, and healthcare, so that it would be maximally useful to people who would not hear it or enter into it through more traditional Dharma gates, whether they were doctors or medical patients, hospital administrators, or insurance companies, end quote. One postscript here is that Kabat-Zinn also invokes the Buddhist concept of apaya, of skillful means. This idea that a great teacher can conceal or subvert or play some sort of trickster role in order to bring people to the Dharma, to the reality. And he explains his fashioning of MBSR as an act of skillful means. This is a controversial claim in his community and in the larger Buddhist community. The mindfulness movement itself is now a billion-dollar industry well beyond MBSR, but Kabat-Zinn's initial rooting of the conception of mindfulness and scientism has defined the mindfulness movement ever since, and has in many ways allowed and incentivized the commercial aspects of the mindfulness movement. Modern mindfulness practices are often discussed in terms of benefits that may be measured, and Jennifer mentioned some of these. Decreasing stress, experiencing greater well-being, managing anxiety, lowering blood pressure, etc. Even with seemingly subjective qualities like greater well-being, the emphasis is on measurable outcomes. And this is so tied into the incentives of scientism that MBSR and other mindfulness programs can now be billed to insurance. The mindfulness movement has also altered the telos, the original telos of the meditation practices. The telos of Buddhist meditation, in a nutshell, is detachment from the world and focus on the extinction of the self, the dissolution of the self. The mindfulness movement's practices of meditation arguably have no telos. Instead, the practices are tools to address any number of things, including body image, stress, and high blood pressure. This becomes interesting when we see that the transformation from Buddhism to the mindfulness movement has meant not just the mindfulness movement itself is affected, but the Buddhist tradition has become increasingly defined by the idiom of scientism. As we've seen, the mindfulness movement values the rational, the empirical, and the therapeutic that are compatible with modern science. And this has prompted an increasing focus on compatibility with these things within Buddhism. Jeff Wilson writes this, quote, "The medicalization of mindfulness or scientization has so convincingly influenced North American Buddhism that many Buddhists see non-Buddhist therapeutic mindfulness as basically identical to their own practice. By implication, traditional aspects of Buddhism that are not psychotherapeutic or scientific, and there are a lot of those, come to seem strange or even be direct obstructions to correct understandings and practices of Buddhism." End quote. This trend of scientization of Buddhism is generally true across different forms of Buddhism, but perhaps especially true in Tibetan Buddhism in that context. The current Dalai Lama, who is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhists, consistently presents Buddhism and science as compatible. For example, the often quoted empirical studies of meditation by researchers Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson began from a conversation with the Dalai Lama about the possibility of sharing Buddhism's methods for taming destructive emotions, sharing them beyond Buddhism. The Dalai Lama said to these researchers, "Test these methods in a lab, freed from religious trappings. Test them rigorously, and if they can help people lessen their destructive emotions, then spread them widely to all who might benefit." Between the work of these researchers and other efforts, much time, energy, and funds have been spent attempting to calculate the physiological and neurological effects of Buddhist meditation, or mindfulness meditation. The referent of scientism that is a result of laicization means that Buddhist contemplative practice priorities and practices are changing. In Buddhist temples across North America that were previously filled with the ritual activities I described earlier, the incense, the spinning of prayer wheels, the ringing of bells, there's been a shift to science as the new standard for judging efficacy of Buddhist practice. And now meditation halls, designed not for ritual action, but for seated meditation specifically, designed for seated meditation specifically, are being added on to Buddhist temples. And in some cases, mindfulness-based stress reduction classes are being offered in those spaces. Some wonder if the telos of Buddhism itself is changing because of the new emphasis on scientism. Rather than working against delusion and attachment to recognize the ultimate emptiness of the self and all things, and to achieve nirvana and this release from the otherwise endless cycle of rebirths, will Buddhism now understand its telos as a much vaguer goal of health and well-being, grounded in the idiom of scientism? This question is generating concern within the Buddhist community. Donald Lopez, the great Tibetologist, is concerned that scientism threatens to bleach Buddhism of its vibrancy, complexity, power, and truth. He writes, Buddhism and science each have their own narrative, each their own telos. If an ancient religion like Buddhism has anything to offer science, it is not in the facile confirmation of its findings. So let's now turn our attention to the contemplative practices within Eastern Christianity with some comparative remarks. I'm going to tell us a few things we already know just to contextualize what else I say. Like Buddhism, Eastern Christian contemplative practices were also born in a monastic context. As early as the 3rd century, we have Christians fleeing to the desert of Egypt and Palestine and Asia Minor to learn how to pray without ceasing, as advised by St. Paul, spawning this tradition that we now call Asceticism. Specific prayer practices of Asceticism were developed in the desert monastic tradition, and then these spread and took root in other places at other times, nourished primarily in monastic communities, such as Mount Athos, and also throughout Russian monasticism, especially since the 17th century. A hallmark of Asceticism is the prayer of the heart, in which the heart, not the mind, is the access point to the true self and the divine, as we've heard several times. The tradition of Asceticism values other ways of knowing than rational and intellectual ways, and its practices cultivate the intuitive and authentic wisdom of the heart. Practices of Asceticism include the Jesus prayer. The prayer itself, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, or variants thereof, is practiced in quiet, repetitive fashion. The telos of Asceticism, including the Jesus prayer, is the telos of Christianity. It's theosis. It's the likeness to and union with God and with all of the cosmos. Interestingly, in the Christian East, the monastic tradition that spawned and developed Asceticism has also affirmed and encouraged lay use of these practices. We see this in the two arguably most important texts on Asceticism, the Philokalia and the Way of a Pilgrim. The introduction of the original Philokalia, published in 1782, references its teachings on prayer this way: the fullness of perfection lies within reach of all, without exception. And this was part of the Colivides movement that Father Damaskinos referred to yesterday. Such affirmations of the access of non-monastics to the Hesychast teachings within the Philokalia continued with its subsequent translations and transmissions into Slavonic and Russian. The narrative and story of the Way of a Pilgrim's composition are both endorsements of lay use of the Jesus prayer. The narrative is a memoir of a simple pilgrim with his sack of bread crusts and his Bible, and later his Philokalia, seeking and finding how to pray unceasingly in the Hesychast tradition. The Way of a Pilgrim is not a single author memoir, although it is written in that fashion. It is clearly a composite monastic work for the express purpose of popularizing the Jesus prayer among the laity. The Way of the Pilgrim is the monastic community's invitation and guide for the laity to engage in this practice of prayer and in its composition. Archbishop Alexander Golitsyn memorably calls the Way of a Pilgrim an instance of monastic evangelism of the Philocalic reform. I wish to acknowledge that although we have these monastic affirmations of lay engagement with Asceticism, There are also many examples of monastic gatekeeping and esotericization of Hesychism to prevent or guard against its lay use. Arguably, there is not incredibly widespread use or knowledge of Hesychism among Eastern Christian lay people. However, at least in word, the monastic tradition has condoned and promoted Hesychism to laity in these critical texts, and this makes its laicization perhaps more natural and less of a departure in comparison to the laicization of Buddhist contemplative practices from their monastic settings. Here in the 21st century, we are beginning to witness a true move of Hesychism from the monastery to the living room, witnessed by the move of Eastern Christianity to new lands, the booming of the publishing of scholarly and non-scholarly texts on Hesychism, and specifically the Jesus Prayer, and including the popularity of the text I mentioned, The Way of a Pilgrim and the Philokalia. Speaking to the contemporary interest in the Philokalia, the late translator of the text, Metropolitan Callistos Ware, called it a spiritual time bomb. Such practices as the Jesus Prayer have left the domain of Eastern Christianity as well. I know of more Catholic and Protestant Jesus Prayer clinics or groups than I do Eastern Christian. So we're witnessing this laicization of Hesychism unfold. As Hesychism continues to laicize, it is not immune from the same pressures and forces at work on Buddhism, including scientism. And this brings me to what is my main question. What might the Eastern Christian community learn from the laicization of Buddhist practices, specifically as concerns scientism? In Buddhism's story of laicization, we've seen an embrace of the epistemology of science, that the quantifiable is what is real and important. Scientific validation and legitimacy have become significant concerns and measures of the value and utility of Buddhist practices. The legitimization through science becomes desirable because of the material incentives in the mindfulness movement in particular. Some mindfulness movement teachers like Kabat-Zinn, as well as some Buddhists, see this as a good thing because the scientific legitimizing of mindfulness practices derived from Buddhism gives wider access to people, and therefore more people encounter the Dharma, more people encounter the Buddhist understanding of reality. Others, particularly within Buddhism, perceive disservice and harm to the Buddhist tradition and its scientization. The concern is that the scientization will reduce Buddhist meditation to quantifiable outcomes, robbing it of its telos. When unquantifiable progress towards enlightenment is no longer valued, then Buddhism changes based on external standards. Complicating matters is the fact that scientific normative standards are not stable. We have acknowledged this. They are always changing, and they are also riddled with fraud and ineptitude, just like everything else. Altering the tradition to fit into the current science means a shifting target rather than a timeless truth. Scientism also values a particular way of knowing that precludes other ways of knowing and being that cannot be quantified. Donald Lopez asked this question: what would it mean if we were to conclude that Buddhism is in fundamental ways incompatible with science? Would that really be so bad? A comparison between our Buddhist example of laicization and scientization and that of Eastern Christianity is imperfect. For one thing, even though Eastern Christianity has also moved to North America and is also subject to these same pressures, it's still very much a minority tradition, and it has little of the kind of exotic Orientalist appeal of Buddhism in the North American setting. Going back to the story of my students, every one of whom raised hands to say they had encountered the mindfulness movement, it's very rare that I teach any class in which anyone raises their hand when I ask them if they have encountered Eastern Christianity, much less Eastern Christianity's contemplative practices. Some would argue that Eastern Christianity may simply be less fungible than Buddhism. For one thing, calling on the name of Jesus in the Jesus Prayer requires a different level of commitment and dedication than, for example, a typical Buddhist extracted mindfulness practice in which one focuses on one's breath. Hesychism may be less portable, extractable, less available for appropriation, which may protect it somewhat from the scientism and other forces that go with laicization, preserving its relationship, this relationship between Hesychism and its telos. However, just because Hesychism has a higher barrier for entry and might be less extractable from the larger tradition of Eastern Christianity does not mean that Eastern Christianity is immune from the scientism that goes along, that seems very paired with laicization. So I propose that Eastern Christians learn from our Buddhist counterparts and thus encounter the pressures and intoxications of scientism thoughtfully and more skeptically. Let me be clear, I'm all for lay practice of Hesychism and have written elsewhere on this topic, and I'm not arguing against the possibility or utility of scientific investigations of the practice of Hesychism, but I am supporting a skeptical relationship there. I would like to avoid the premise that science is or should be the validating epistemological basis for evaluating Eastern Christianity's Hesychist tradition. Like Donald Lopez's concerns about Buddhism, I would like to avoid scientism bleaching Eastern Christianity of its vibrancy, complexity, power, and truth, and avoid the reduction of mystical experience to certain areas of brain activity. This requires a clear-eyed view of what we hope to gain from scientific investigations of Hesychism, be they neurological or therapeutic or otherwise. And I have a few questions we might ask ourselves as we consider the utility and ethics of the scientific examination of Hesychism. What is the purpose or goal of scientifically investigating Hesychism? Do we seek to harmonize our tradition with contemporary science or legitimize our tradition to a religion-skeptical audience? Do we hope to demonstrate health and physical benefits from scientific investigation? And if so, how would this change what we do? How would this change our practices? Do we hope to missionize through scientific investigation or validation of our practices? Do we hope to evaluate the effectiveness of our own practices using the norms of scientism? As the contemplative practices of Eastern Christianity continue to laicize, I do not want Eastern Christianity to capitulate to the main myth of scientism, that only things that can be quantified are of value and true. Central to Hesychism, and we've heard this several times this weekend, is the knowledge that things that cannot be quantified are valuable, that there are immeasurable but no less true ways of knowing and being that are part of our theosis. This is something I think the Eastern Christian tradition has to offer and that the world sorely needs today. Thank you.
As you can see, we have time for questions.
Thank you both for your presentations. I was really fascinated by Father Stephen and talking about our neurons in the gut, and I was curious, how much do you know about how fasting impacts the neurons in our gut and our overall, in the body overall?
That's an easy one. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I guess the last question. Father Stephen, you and Father Luke yesterday both referred to tears and something called gift of tears. So far we've heard in terms of prayer, mindfulness, and calmness and stillness. But
things come to mind. One is that years ago, when I was schooling Buddhism, I found that there was one weeping Buddha. Most of the time you don't have that. It was unusual. I thought, well, why doesn't Buddha have tears? But I think over the last 45 years of therapy and pastoral work, the central question for me has been what I've tried to observe and part of my life's journey is about an encounter with the other that happens this way and this way. And tears are a manifestation of a moment's communication of the heart, the impact of the candle, the points of grace to the body, the mind, and the feeling. And it nuances all three of these. But it's, the teaching is if tears come to you in prayer, don't mess with it. Stop what you're doing. Even St. Theophan says if you read something and your heart is warm, stop. It's enough. Don't continue doing this. So here's a manifestation that is size too deep for words, and it has a character of relationality. It's not something you try to make happen, and if it comes from grace, it always has something you don't know how it got there. And suddenly, you may have had a stomachache, or who knows what, and all of a sudden, just like this, something has changed, and its quality is different. And what interests me is that in psychotherapy and in prayer and in confession and in relics, when this happens, it's something that is similar in each one of these cases when it is, you may be saying the prayer. An old elder said to me, the heart warms it, the mind knows you're praying, but it doesn't pray. The heart prays. So if you're saying the Psalms or something, all of a sudden, something takes flight because there's an other. And now faith, hope, and love are present in a palpable way that weren't there before. So tears is, St. Sophrony says that there's so many types of tears he doesn't even talk about it because it's like snow, yes, no.
I was wondering if you could talk about the connection between Buddhist metaphysics and their spiritual practices. Because it seems to me that if I'm right in understanding that the first principle is nothingness in Buddhism, that would make it more susceptible to appropriation by medicine. So,
What was the last thing that you said? I missed just the last sentence or two.
well, if the first principle of Buddhism is nothingness, not nothingness beyond being, but just nothingness, then that would make it, would be easy to appropriate that into a culture that effectively believes in just analytical, it's just material emotion. We have to figure out some way to live in that world. So, right, so as you see it, what is the connection between spiritual practices and authentic Buddhist metaphysics?
Okay, I'll take a shot at this, and you tell me if I aim in the right direction. So yes, this idea of nothingness, of voidness, this idea that there is nothing that has some sort of permanent substance to it, that realization, and then kind of clicking into that realization metaphysics, and we should, and talk about voidness and the dissolution of the self. But I also want to make clear that there's a lot else going on in the Buddhist cosmology. There are deities, there are dakinis, these female spirits that are prophetesses and so forth. There's a hagiographic tradition, a huge hagiographic tradition, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. So when we think about Buddhist metaphysics, I want to just enlarge in that to think about all these other aspects of the tradition. Does that make sense?
I want to first thank Catholic University and its Institute for the Study of Eastern Christianity and the opportunity we have here today. From all the speakers, and specifically thank you both. I don't want to detract or change what Nick brought up as a very important point, the gift of tears. But I did want to ask Father Stephan about the use of eye movements in therapy, eye movement therapy, and of course the Orthodox perspective in understanding.
Well, I think eye movement therapy is one of the more value-free approaches. And at this point, it's been around so long that I'm sure it's used differently by a lot of people. Even when I'm doing the sakas, where they're watching my fingers, at the end of each one, I make the sign of the cross. So I don't know if you want to refine that question. I don't see any real problem in it. I know years ago when I was having conversations in Russia, they really couldn't see any value, at least this group I was talking to in psychology. They were afraid of it. Everything was that they thought a competing value with Christianity. But I think as long as the ontological, psychological distinction is made, and there's this awareness of what we're doing, we can realize we all have to, that we come from a certain place. We have the emerging form of orthodoxy, but the ethos of our culture, and they're both in us. And so we have to be aware that that's part of what is our distortion as well as our movement to the vote. Now, I'm not sure if you were connecting the tears to that or you're changing the subject, because I didn't quite get that.
Yeah, not change the subject, because Nick brought up such a good
Oh, okay.
essential.
Okay, so there is something fascinating. I didn't think about that part. I had a man years ago when I first started doing EMDR who had not shed a tear in 9 sessions. I'd never done EMDR with him, so I said, let's try it. He was weeping in seconds. Now, why? EMDR has been studied like we're talking about in terms of science, but it's still very unclear how this works. But my simplistic view is that when you're occupying part of the genetic mind and the conscious will, watching your fingers or tapping or whatever, the Muse is able to travel in other places that then can connect with something, and you have a connection with the therapist. It's very intimate. I'm sitting very close to the person, so the space proximity is very close. So I believe that this supports like a kind of anesthesia and occupies the part of the mind so that the other work can be done. So the idea is that if the person's in trouble, they hold up their hand and we stop and talk. So they're always in control, they always know everything that's going on. It's not hypnosis at all. But I tell them, if you don't hold up your hand and you hyperventilate, you feel rage, you weep, I will know that this is working and we're going to go through it. And so they have the experience of presence with someone, safety in the office, and the willingness and freedom to encounter what has been pushed out of. So the man who wept after 9 sessions got in touch with something that he was never able to in talk therapy. This is part of the remarkableness of EMDR, which sometimes is very fast, and I've been repeatedly surprised by it. But it's not the only way to do things.
people pray the Jesus prayer alone, but there's meant to be a wider community with relationships, sometimes a spiritual elder, sometimes not. So I do think those things, insulate a little bit towards some sort of extraction. But when I look at these other places where I've seen the Jesus prayer being taught, Protestant contexts, Catholic contexts, it's not clear to me if it is being integrated and understood in that context, that larger context of the life of the church. So I wonder about that, and I just don't have enough information to speculate.
I'd like to comment on that too. When centering prayer was introduced by Father Thomas Key and that group, it really followed after, I think, Benson's relaxation response. And I think in some ways, and then you have like Cynthia Rochelle and who's a very popular Richard Boyd. Yeah. From my perspective, these are dogmatically different from an Orthodox perspective. And it creates a difference. And virgins, especially, I think, Roar and Rochelle are beautiful writers, and I love a lot of what they do, but I think it's into that New Age type of thing that I really believe that Father Sophrony is very accurate when he says that dogma of asceticism, prayer, and sacrament must be united. And this is part of, I think, what you're raising up for us when this drifts. It's kind of a drift in culture. And because our culture is whatever we like, gets, what, 1 million likes, and then it's an influencer. So then we have a reality that may not at all be even that.
You mentioned that within therapy, there have Buddhist practices and scientists as well. I guess, are you aware of tantric sex? I don't know the appropriate is. So, I guess again, it's a comment and a question. I guess when you see like with the new trend with transgender therapy or gender therapy, do you see obviously some sort of influence in that? Or when you go to therapists in general, they ask you questions, and as you said, they can be somewhat of a trickster role. Do you see some like, I guess, influence in that of wanting people to not only be something other than themselves, or perhaps maybe tend toward like homosexual practice or behavior?
Frankly, I don't feel like I have a lot to offer to this question, so I'm going to turn it over to Father Stephen and see what he has to say. But I will say, where I see it happening in a therapeutic setting is usually in the context of anxiety and depression. Mindfulness movement techniques derived from Buddhism. That's where I see these techniques being employed with those particular ailments.
This opens up another conference. That question on one thought is Metropolitan Callisto Swear's comment that we're in an anthropological question for us. I think this is at the level of counsel. It's like an iconoclasm, only it's an anthropological iconoclasm. And I have some thoughts about it. I do think that the postmodern self-construction identity stuff is largely a form of evolution and degroundedness from an orthodox standpoint. It's a serious problem because now it's ideologically instantiated in the culture and in HR departments and ethics and stopping science from investigating. Because the etiology of these things is so wide that with the restrictions on being able to do good research, it's very hard to address it from a scientific standpoint, much less the religious side, which the Orthodox have been very slow to even take up, except sometimes as a process. So this is a really important question, and I'm getting in therapy now families really suffering in this, and the only thing I can say is that it's always, the approach must be love. You can hold on to your theology, your view, but when you're with someone, especially a family member, who is now utterly different than anything you ever dreamed of or wanted to be, you must pay the suffering price of love and keep the dialogue open. And this will be sometimes a lifelong thing because, you know, either a new gender change or you marry someone of your same sex, and now you have family relations, all sorts of stuff. So it doesn't stop. It's ongoing. And this is a lay ascetic struggle. This is a huge one for our people. And one other thing, in terms of lay in prayer, I didn't get to mention this in the paper, but Elder Harlan was one of St. Joseph de Hesegast's 5 disciples. When he talks about the Syrophoenician woman, he said she has a prayer of the heart. This is very extraordinary in one statement. This is a lay woman. She's a married person. She loves her daughter. She comes to Christ and can't be humiliated by being insulted by a macroaggression, not a microaggression. Because she has apatheia, because she has love. She has a prayer of the heart, because she has psychosomatic unity. Because she loves someone other than herself so much that she is an icon of Christ. So this is showing us that our marriages, our families, our struggles with our children, and our grandchildren, and one another is the arena. And we need the prayer.
I know 2 questions.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm a very concrete thinker, and this is a point for me. And you discuss the neuroviolence of God, and you and then the neuropeptide studies of NIH. What I'm trying to wrap my head around is whenever you talk about the heart, you're pointing to the heart. You're pointing to an organ that I'm seeing, but obviously it's not the heart. Are you referring to the soul or something else?
Okay, thank you. First, about the gut. The neurons are in the line of the gut, and the vagus nerve is part of that system that influences the brain, and the heart does it. So they're all in communication with each other. And that's literally the heart in the body, but not the phenomenological heart of the father. So I appreciate that. In the Greek, Elias could mean womb, heart, or solar plexus. I think I wouldn't want to pinpoint, objectify these things, because I think the psychosomatic core of the human being is the heart. And that, as we've talked about here, has an embodied quality to it. It has something finer than that, and it supersedes, goes beyond the body in its relationship with the divine energies and with the person of Christ. So we beings in the likeness, potential likeness of God, can take on a different mode of being, and we're raised bodily, we're transformed bodily. So I would not want to say, this is the news, this is the heart. I want to leave it phenomenologically open so that only experience can teach you that. You can't know it from getting words about it, like St. Isaac the Syrian says, if you haven't tasted honey, no one can help you with that. You have to taste it. And until we get some experiential markers, these things will remain opaque to us. And as Jennifer was speaking about, and we try to study them from outside, we have 2 problems. One, the objectification of it. The other is etymologically, the very way we feel words that we use are shaped by our culture, which is so unconscious for us that it's a wonder we can even speak to one another. It's an amazing thing that we're using. So sometimes we have the same words and we don't understand
Yes, I'm a Greek Orthodox, and I feel very fortunate that I am part of a Jesus prayer group. But this is not common throughout the parishes. I'm talking at the lay level. Why do Orthodox priests, why are they basically seem like afraid of this? You know, I would like to see a Jesus prayer group in every single parish.
So St. Sophronius monks pray in community that way. And so what we started doing is for our ministry study, we always begin with the Jesus prayer. So we may have, say, 15 or 20 people, so depending on how many are there. You say 5 Jesus prayer, and then the next one, and then as a little bit as I did with my students, depending on how it is, and then as we finish it, they're getting used to science. And when they used to come in and talk about politics and stuff and the social things, now they've come to appreciate the science. And that means that when we read books together, they take them in differently. They have different dialogues with one another. They learn that one another are iconographic, and that our community as Orthodox is built out of that. I think that in a tiny, tiny, tiny way, that's like what Basich Boskovsky brought to the other countries that were new to them. And St. Sophronius somewhere says, if you teach one family to pray, and they will help another, in 10 years you'll have a core group and you'll begin to have a church. My view is, you're exactly right. I don't know why I wouldn't hesitate to say that about a priest who's not want to do it. I think they're just overworked. And you've got so many liturgies and so much to do that they're just trying to stay above the water, but it's very difficult. But I do believe that if 50 or 60% of the Greek Orthodox children are leaving the church when they go to college, my view is it's because they got Greek dancing and baklava, and they did not get what we're talking about here. And had they gotten that, they would never leave.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. And here we will break for lunch. And this is the end of the live streaming. So I'd like to thank everyone that joined us today virtually. We had more than 130 people joining us virtually this morning. So thank you, goodbye, and see you soon again. For those of us that are here, we are breaking for lunch, and we will be meeting again at 2:30 for 2 clinics, Contemplative Prayer Clinic and Iconography Clinic. We will meet here, and from here we will guide the 2 groups to the locations. The prayer clinic will meet at the Byzantine chapel in the shrine, and the iconography clinic will meet in Cannon Hall 108, but we will guide you there. So be here at 2:30, and depending on which clinic you want to join, we will guide you there. And the conference will close with closing comments, brief closing comments, and a celebration of Vespers at the Byzantine shrine, the Byzantine chapel in the shrine, the Basilica. The Basilica is this large, huge church on campus. If you go down to the crypt, to the basement, there is a Byzantine chapel. You can't miss it. It looks very different from all the other chapels. And you will see people there, you will see us, so you know where it's going. So thank you very much again. Thank you to our speakers, and see you soon.